Arc Raiders is absolutely packed with hidden details, Easter eggs and buried lore that most players never slow down enough to actually notice. And this video is my attempt to collect all of it and walk through it with you. I put this together because Arc Raiders is one of those games where the world does a lot of its storytelling quietly. Most of the time you're playing, you're focused on surviving, gathering resources and making it back underground. But if you slow down and look at things, the graffiti on crumbling walls, the item descriptions that don't quite match expectations, the way certain Arc machines seem to pause before engaging, there's a whole other layer underneath. When assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to focus on smaller, less discussed details rather than broad strokes. Most people already know the big picture. The ARCAs came from somewhere. The surface is dangerous, humans live underground. What I wanted to do here was focus on the in-between stuff, the things that suggest a much more complicated story. I've also chosen to present a lot of this as possibilities rather than facts, because honestly, a lot of Arc Raiders lore is genuinely ambiguous, and I think that ambiguity is worth respecting. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Fall, What the ARCs Left Behind. When they arrived. The fall of the ARCs is the central event of Arc Raiders' world, and yet the game is surprisingly quiet about exactly how it happened. Most of what players encounter on the surface suggests a sudden, overwhelming arrival. Buildings weren't evacuated in any organised way. Personal belongings were left behind mid-use. In some locations you can find tables still set for meals that were never eaten. The world didn't end slowly. It ended in the middle of an ordinary day. One of the most repeated pieces of environmental storytelling in Arc Raiders is the overturned vehicle. Across multiple surface zones, you'll find cars and trucks flipped on their sides, sometimes in the middle of roads, sometimes crashed into storefronts. The positioning of many of these vehicles suggests panic rather than accident. They weren't just involved in collisions, some of them were moving fast when they stopped. The roads near them show long skid marks, and in a few cases the vehicles are pointed away from the urban centres, suggesting people were trying to leave. What's interesting about those vehicles is that almost none of them contain any Arc-related damage. There are no scorch marks, no impact craters nearby, no evidence of being struck. The vehicles crashed because of the humans driving them, not because of any direct attack. This points towards something the game seems to suggest repeatedly, that a lot of the initial casualties during the fall were the result of panic, not precision targeting. People fled, and in fleeing they caused accidents. Infrastructure collapsed not because of Arc bombardment, but because of human systems failing under pressure. If you look closely at some of the older buildings on the surface, you'll find a particular kind of window damage that doesn't match what you'd expect from the Arc machines. The upper floors of tall structures sometimes have broken windows, with glass scattered outward, rather than inward. This is a small detail, but it suggests the breakage came from inside. One possible reading is that people were trapped in upper floors and broke windows trying to signal for help, or trying to escape. The Arc machines were down at street level. Whatever was happening on those upper floors, it wasn't an Arc attack. There's a category of item in Arc Raiders that players often overlook because it doesn't have obvious gameplay value. Personal letters, handwritten notes, and printed documents that appear in residential locations. Most of these are incomplete or damaged, but the fragments that are readable paint a fairly consistent picture of the days leading up to the fall. There were warnings, not official government warnings, but informal ones. Notes between neighbours, hurried messages scratched on scraps of paper, references to something strange happening in the sky. The fall didn't come without any signal at all. Some people knew something was wrong before it happened. The nature of those warnings is interesting to piece together. The notes don't describe the ARCs in any clear way. They describe lights, unusual sounds at night, and a strange interference with electronic devices. Some notes mention that radios stopped working before anything else. This detail shows up in multiple locations across different zones, which suggests it's intentional. Radio blackout before the fall. That detail points towards something that, at minimum, wanted to disrupt communication before making its presence known. Whether that was a deliberate strategy or simply a side effect of the ARC's technology is something the game leaves open. One of the more unsettling Easter eggs in Ark Raiders involves what players have come to call the last broadcast fragments. These are audio clips that can be found stored on specific terminals scattered across the surface. Not all of them are accessible in normal gameplay, and some require going out of your way to find them. When played back, they sound like fragments of emergency broadcasts, the kind that would have aired on public systems during a crisis. But the content of those broadcasts is strange. They don't describe evacuation routes or shelter locations. They describe things that were being observed in the sky, and then they just stop, mid-sentence in most cases. The mid-sentence cut-offs on those broadcasts are worth paying attention to. In a narrative crafted with care, a thing that ends abruptly is almost always a choice. These aren't broadcasts that ended because the recording was damaged. The way they cut off suggests the signal itself was interrupted. Something stopped those broadcasts from reaching their intended audience. And given the timing, each broadcast appears to have been recorded in what would have been the early hours of the fall. It's reasonable to interpret this as the ARCs actively disrupting communication infrastructure right at the start. Not just as a side effect, deliberately. Moving away from audio and into visual details, there's something strange about the graffiti in Ark Raiders. Most post-apocalyptic games use graffiti as background texture, something to make spaces feel lived in without putting too much thought into the content. Ark Raiders seems to have done something different. If you photograph or simply study the graffiti that appears in human-inhabited areas, both old surface zones and places near underground entrances, patterns emerge. The same symbols appear in multiple unconnected locations. Not the same words, not the same tags, but the same underlying shapes incorporated into different pieces. Those repeated graffiti symbols have never been formally explained by the developers. Community researchers have mapped them across multiple zones and found that they cluster around specific locations, usually near large Ark machines, or near structures that seem to have some kind of significance in the game's geography. One possible reading is that these symbols are a kind of raider shorthand, a way of marking locations worth knowing about. Another reading is that they predate the raider communities and were made by survivors in the immediate aftermath of the fall, trying to communicate something. A third reading, and the one I find most interesting, is that some of them aren't human-made at all. The idea that some of the graffiti symbols might not be human is a stretch, but it's worth examining. In a handful of locations where those recurring symbols appear, the placement makes human creation difficult to explain. Some of them are high up on smooth metal surfaces with no obvious way to reach them. Some are on the undersides of overpasses. In one location, a symbol appears on the floor of a room that shows no footprints in the dust around it. None of this is conclusive, but it points toward the possibility that someone, or something, is leaving marks in the world for reasons that haven't been fully explained yet. The Ark machines themselves are another source of hidden details. Most players interact with them as threats or obstacles, things to avoid or eliminate, but the machines have behavioural patterns that, if watched long enough, suggest something more than simple hostile programming. Certain Ark patrol units will stop in specific locations for longer than their patrol loop should require. They don't appear to be scanning or responding to stimuli. They just stop, remain still for a period, and then continue. The locations where this happens aren't random. They tend to cluster near the same kinds of structural features, certain doorways, certain intersections, certain open spaces. What those stopping locations have in common isn't immediately obvious, but community researchers have mapped them as well. The overlap with the graffiti symbol locations is partial, but real. Some of the spots where ARC patrols stop correspond to locations marked with those recurring symbols. Not all of them, and the relationship isn't clean enough to call certain, but the correlation is there. One possible interpretation is that the ARC machines are aware of whatever those symbols mean. Another is simpler. Both the symbols and the patrol stops correspond to something in the environment that players haven't fully identified yet. Some kind of feature that both human survivors and ARC machines have independently noticed. The architecture of the surface zones in ARC Raiders rewards close attention in ways that most games don't bother with. The buildings aren't just generic post-apocalyptic ruins. They have design details that suggest specific histories. A cluster of industrial buildings in one zone has infrastructure modifications that appear to predate the fall. Someone added reinforced doors, removed windows, and installed internal barriers in ways that would make sense as security upgrades, not as ARC damage. The modifications look like they were made quickly and without much planning, but they were made. Whoever was in that building complex was preparing for something before the fall happened. Connected to that is the question of what those industrial buildings were used for. The equipment inside doesn't match standard industrial purposes. Some of it resembles communication arrays. Some of it resembles the kind of hardware you'd use for large-scale data processing. In the context of a pre-fall world where the ARCs were arriving, this cluster of buildings starts to look less like a factory and more like an emergency response operation. Someone was trying to track or communicate with the ARCs before the fall completed. Whether they succeeded in making contact is something the game doesn't answer directly. One Easter egg that falls into the category of blink and you'll miss it involves specific item spawn locations on the surface. Items in loot-focused games usually follow simple logic. Appropriate items in appropriate places. Medical supplies in hospitals, food in grocery stores, ammunition in military outposts. ARC Raiders follows that logic most of the time, but there are exceptions. In a residential zone, inside an ordinary apartment, in a drawer that requires opening furniture, rather than just looting a shelf, there are documents that belong to a professional context. Technical schematics, not for household devices, for something larger and more complex, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a government facility, not a home. The contents of those schematics, to the extent that they're legible, depict something that doesn't match any known ARC machine design. The proportions are different. The structural logic is different. Whatever is being depicted in those documents is large, enclosed, and appears to have both mechanical and biological components. The biological elements are stylized and might be interpreted differently depending on who's looking, but several community researchers have flagged this independently and reached similar conclusions. Something in those schematics incorporates organic material in its design. Whether that organic material is human, animal, or something else hasn't been determined. The presence of those schematics in a residential apartment rather than a research facility is the detail that sticks with me. The most straightforward explanation is that whoever lived in that apartment brought their work home. They were involved in whatever those schematics described, and they kept copies outside of official channels. That suggests either paranoia about security or concern that the official location of those schematics might not remain safe. Given that the fall happened, the second interpretation feels significant. Whoever lived there knew that wherever the originals were kept would eventually be compromised. The underground communities that players operate out of have their own set of hidden details worth examining. The stations and tunnels that serve as home bases weren't originally built as human habitats. The infrastructure is repurposed. Older signage, pipes, and structural elements suggest this is converted transit infrastructure, the kind that would have been used for subway systems or large underground transit networks. The conversion was done under pressure. Support structures were improvised. Some walls show evidence of having been built quickly, with whatever material was available, rather than with proper construction materials. Within those underground spaces, if you look at the older layers, places where the raider habitation is thinner and you can see more of the original structure, there are maintenance markings that predate both the fall and the raider conversion. Standard infrastructure symbols mostly, date stamps, inspection records, capacity notations, but in a few locations these markings include something non-standard, symbols that don't belong to any known infrastructure system. They're small and easy to overlook amid the larger official markings, but they're there. They appear to have been added by hand, not printed or stamped, which means someone with access to these tunnels was leaving their own marks alongside the official ones. Continuing through the underground environments, there are sealed sections in multiple base locations. Doors that are welded or blocked that don't lead to accessible gameplay areas. In most games, these would simply be unfinished content or design limitations. In Arc Raiders, some of these sealed sections have details around them that suggest intentional obscuring. Scratches on the floor from furniture or objects that were dragged in front of doors. Black paint over windows adjacent to some of the sealed doors. In one location, what appears to be a combination lock that has been deliberately damaged so that it can't be opened. These aren't doors that were sealed to keep something out. They were sealed to keep people from going in. The question of what's behind those sealed sections in the base areas is one of the larger unresolved mysteries in the game's lore community. A number of theories exist and they range from the practical to the elaborate. The practical version is that these are storage areas that became associated with specific individuals or groups and were sealed off when those people were no longer around. The more elaborate version connects these sealed sections to the underground community's history, specifically to whatever happened in the early days after the fall, when the first survivors were figuring out how to live underground. Something happened in those rooms that the current community has chosen not to discuss. The raider community in Arc Raiders isn't portrayed as uniformly cohesive. There are tensions between different groups, different philosophies about how to relate to the surface and to the Arc machines, and different histories. Some of these tensions are discussed openly through NPC dialogue. Others are suggested more quietly through environmental details. In one area of the base, 2 sets of personal belongings are stored in adjacent sections, and if you look at the objects, the tools, the decorations, the small personal items, they're clearly from different people, with very different backgrounds. But the 2 sets are stored together, neatly, in a way that suggests whoever curated them wanted to keep them close. It reads like a memorial. Memorials appear throughout Arc Raiders in ways that are easy to miss. Not formal monuments, but quiet ones. Personal objects, arranged deliberately. Names scratched into surfaces. Small collections of items that have no practical purpose, but obvious personal significance. The raider communities mark loss in these informal ways, and there are more of these small memorials scattered through the game than most players ever notice. The density of them in certain areas points towards specific events, places where something happened that caused loss on a scale the community felt needed acknowledging. One cluster of those informal memorials is located in a section of underground infrastructure that appears to have been used as a medical area. The arrangement of beds and supplies matches emergency triage more than organised medical care. This wasn't a clinic, it was a place where people were brought when there was nowhere else to bring them. The memorials in this section are denser than in almost any other location in the base areas. And among them, tucked behind what was once a storage shelf, there's a list, handwritten. Names, and next to each name, a date. The dates are all within a very short window. Whatever happened here, it happened fast. The dates on that list fall within a period that doesn't correspond to any known major Arc Raiders lore event. The community has tried to place it on a timeline relative to the fall, relative to the founding of the Raider settlements, relative to various things mentioned in official law materials. None of it quite lines up. The most straightforward interpretation is that the list records deaths from a localized event, an accident, an attack, an outbreak of illness that isn't part of the main law narrative. But the number of names and the density of the memorials around it suggests something more significant than a localized incident. Shifting focus to the surface zones, the ecological details of Ark raiders are another area where hidden information accumulates. The surface isn't just structurally damaged, the ecology has changed. Vegetation patterns don't follow normal growth logic for abandoned urban spaces. In many areas where you'd expect significant plant colonization, the kind that happens when cities are left untended for years, there's very little growth. And in other areas, particularly around the remains of Ark impact sites or major Ark structures, there's growth that seems accelerated and unusual. Different species, different patterns, different characteristics. The plants growing around Ark impact sites and major Ark structures are visually distinctive enough that once you notice them, you start seeing them everywhere. They have a specific color range and growth pattern that doesn't appear in areas without Ark influence. Whether this is meant to suggest some kind of biological contamination or a different effect is ambiguous, but the consistency of it across different zones and different types of Ark sites suggests it's intentional. The Ark machines, or whatever they emit, are changing the biology of the areas around them, and that change has been going on long enough to be visibly established. Alongside the unusual vegetation, there are animals in Ark raiders. Not many, and not prominently featured, but they're there in the background of certain zones, and their behaviour is strange. Animals in post-apocalyptic settings are usually either absent or depicted as aggressive scavengers. The animals in Ark raiders don't quite fit either category. Some of them show behaviours that suggest familiarity with the Ark machines rather than fear. In one location, a small cluster of birds is perched on an active Ark machine, completely undisturbed by its movement and noise. The machine makes no effort to dislodge them. That image of birds on a moving Ark machine is one of the more quietly strange things in the game. The machines are clearly hostile toward humans. They pursue, attack, and have caused enormous destruction to human civilization. But the birds don't register them as threats. One possible reading is simply that animals lack the cognitive ability to recognize the machines as dangerous in the way humans do. Another reading, which the game seems to nudge toward without ever stating directly, is that the Ark machines aren't indiscriminately hostile. They target humans specifically. The birds are safe because they aren't human. Whatever protocol the machines are following, it's more targeted than it appears at first. The targeting behavior of Ark machines is something that lore-focused players have studied extensively, and the conclusions are consistently unsettling. The machines don't attack everything. They avoid certain structures in ways that appear deliberate. There are buildings on the surface that show no Ark damage whatsoever, despite being adjacent to areas of heavy destruction. These undamaged structures don't have anything immediately obvious in common. They're not all the same type of building, they're not all in the same zone. But if you look closely enough, they share architectural features, specific design elements that appear to have been either standard at a certain period or added specifically in anticipation of the fall. The idea that some surface structures were built or modified to survive Ark attention brings up a significant question. How would anyone know what architectural features would matter to Ark machines? Before the fall, there was apparently no public knowledge that the ARCs were coming. And yet, if some structures were specifically designed to be overlooked by them, that design knowledge had to come from somewhere. One possible reading is that whoever built or modified those structures had information about the ARCs that wasn't publicly available, information that would have been, at minimum, unofficial, and possibly obtained in ways that weren't sanctioned. Following that thread, There are a handful of surface locations that feel qualitatively different from the rest, not because they're more or less damaged, but because they feel prepared. Storage is organized, infrastructure is maintained. In some cases, supplies are cached in ways that suggest they were placed deliberately, not abandoned. Someone visited these locations after the fall and arranged things carefully. The raider communities have obviously been using the surface for some time, but the caching in these locations predates raider activity based on the dust accumulation and material degradation. Whoever did this was there early, right after the fall or possibly during it. Those early surface caches contain a mix of practical supplies and, less obviously, practical materials. The practical items are what you'd expect: preserved food, medical basics, tools. The less practical materials include things like sealed containers with documentation inside, devices that appear to be recording equipment, and in one location, a collection of what appear to be soil and plant samples, sealed and labelled. Someone was gathering evidence right at the start of the fall, not just trying to survive, but trying to document and preserve information about what was happening. That degree of deliberate data collection in the middle of a catastrophe suggests either remarkable composure or the fact that the person doing it knew in advance that it was going to happen. The Ark Machine's structures, the large fixed installations rather than the mobile patrol units, are a source of some of the most opaque Easter eggs in the game. Their external surfaces have markings that players have catalogued extensively. Some of these markings appear to be functional labels, the Ark equivalent of maintenance markings or component identifiers. Others appear to be purely decorative, which is a strange quality for what are essentially machines. Machines don't decorate themselves for aesthetic reasons. The decorative markings, if that's what they are, suggest either that the beings who created the Ark machines had aesthetic considerations built into the design, or that the markings aren't decorative at all and their function simply isn't understood. One specific set of markings on a large Ark installation in one of the later accessible zones has attracted particular attention. The markings are arranged in a pattern that, when viewed from above, which requires getting to an elevated position that takes some effort, forms a legible shape. The shape is geometric and repeating, and it matches a pattern that appears in one of the pre-fall documents found in a residential location. The document in question is a piece of what appears to be academic literature, referencing mathematical patterns in natural systems. The connection between the Ark installation markings and the pre-fall academic document is either coincidence or a deliberate lore link. If it's a deliberate link, the implication is that someone studying mathematical patterns in natural systems prior to the fall either predicted something about the Hierarchies or was working with information that originated from them. The academic document predates the fall by what appears to be several years based on its printing date, which rules out it being produced in response to the Hierarchies. If the connection is real, someone was describing Ark design principles in academic language before the Hierarchies arrived. That's a significant suggestion. It implies either reverse-engineered knowledge from prior contact, or that whatever drives Ark design also underlies certain natural mathematical systems. The underground architecture in Ark Raiders has a layer of history that players can partially reconstruct through careful observation. The bases weren't built from scratch. They expanded from existing infrastructure. And within that existing infrastructure, there are remnants of multiple periods of human occupation. The most recent layer is the raider community. Below that are marks from an earlier group, less organised, evidenced by hurried modifications and simpler survival arrangements. Below that is the original infrastructure. And in some locations, below the original infrastructure, there are markings and modifications that don't belong to any period of human occupation that players can identify. Those deepest layer markings in the underground infrastructure are genuinely hard to categorize. They're not in any recognizable human language or symbol system. They're not Arc machine markings, which have a distinct visual style that players have documented well enough to recognize. They appear on structural elements of the underground system that, based on the infrastructure surrounding them, would have been laid down at the time of original construction. Someone, or something, was present in these underground spaces before humans converted them, and left marks that humans haven't been able to read. The possibility that something else was using underground infrastructure before humans is one of those threads that the game introduces and then doesn't follow up on in any explicit way. It's entirely possible that those deep layer markings are an Easter egg that points toward a future story direction, something that hasn't been explored in the current version of the game. But the care with which they're placed, small, consistent, in locations that require effort to reach, suggests they were put there intentionally and aren't just background texture. They mean something. What that something is hasn't been fully worked out yet. Coming back to the surface for a moment, the water systems in Ark Raiders reward close observation. The game doesn't feature water as a primary gameplay element, but water infrastructure exists throughout the world. Rivers, canals, pipes, reservoirs. The state of these water systems tells a story. In zones close to major Ark installations, the water shows visible contamination, a colour and clarity change that suggests chemical or physical alteration. In zones further from Ark influence, the water is cleaner. The gradient is consistent across different zones. The ARCs are affecting the water supply, and the effect spreads outward from their positions. The water contamination gradient is interesting because it has a shape that implies a specific mechanism. If the contamination were simply the result of Ark machines physically damaging water infrastructure, you'd expect random pockets of contamination wherever pipes were broken. But the contamination follows a more regular pattern, concentric rather than random, with the heaviest contamination centered on specific Ark sites. This points toward the ARCs emitting something rather than simply disrupting existing systems. Something is coming out of those Ark installations and moving through the water table. The game doesn't explain what it is, but community researchers have noted that the contaminated water zones correspond closely to the unusual vegetation growth zones mentioned earlier. Putting the contaminated water and the unusual vegetation together creates a picture of localized ecological transformation radiating outward from Ark installation sites. The ARCs aren't just occupying space on the surface, they're changing it. The changes appear to be gradual but cumulative. The longer an Ark installation has been present in a location, the more pronounced the ecological transformation. This has implications for the longer narrative of the game that haven't been fully explored. If the surface continues to change, the surface accessible to raiders changes with it. The world they're operating in is actively shifting. The raider NPCs who comment on surface conditions occasionally reference changes they've observed over time. Most of these comments are brief and easy to miss in the flow of normal gameplay, but if you pay attention, a consistent thread emerges. The surface used to be different, more accessible in certain areas, more stable in others. The changes have been gradual enough that they're measured in seasons rather than days, but they're real. The older NPCs describe surface conditions from earlier in their experience that don't match what the current game environment shows. The world is being transformed, and people who've been paying attention have noticed. One NPC in particular, whose dialogue is spread across multiple conversation nodes and requires some effort to exhaust, describes a specific location on the surface that they visited years ago and recently revisited. The description of the change is understated. They mention it almost in passing, but the specifics are striking. An area that was once relatively safe and frequently used by raiders is now avoided entirely, not because of Ark machine activity, but because of the environmental changes. The vegetation, the water, the air quality, all of it has shifted enough that the area is no longer viable. The NPC doesn't attribute this to the ARCs directly. They just describe what changed. But the implication is clear. Buried in the item description system, which players often interact with, but rarely read carefully, are clues about the pre-fall world that aren't available through any other means. Standard items, containers, tools, basic supplies have descriptions that often include details about their origin. Manufacturer names, model numbers, regions of production. Most of this is background flavour, but occasionally the description includes something that doesn't fit the standard pre-fall corporate context. Manufacturer names that don't correspond to any real-world analogue and aren't found in other game materials. Model numbers that contain embedded sequences. Regions of production that are specific enough to locate on a map. Those specific production regions that show up in item descriptions cluster around locations that are significant in the game's geography. Not randomly distributed across the pre-fall world's manufacturing base, but concentrated. If you plot the production origins of items found in the game, a pattern emerges. Certain industrial regions were producing a disproportionate share of what was in use just before the fall. This kind of concentration could simply reflect the game's need to keep its lore geography manageable, but it could also suggest that certain regions were more important than others in whatever was happening in the final period before the Hierarchies arrived. One of those concentrated production regions corresponds to a part of the surface map that is, in current gameplay, among the most heavily Ark-occupied zones. The area shows more Ark machine density and more significant structural Ark presence than almost anywhere else on the surface, whether that's because the Hierarchies prioritized it for whatever reason they prioritize things, or whether the manufacturing concentration there made it a natural target, or whether there's a connection between what was being produced in that region and the Ark machines themselves. The game leaves all of those possibilities open. Another detail that's easy to walk past is the variation in how Ark machines respond to different raider equipment. Most players notice the difference in combat terms. Some gear is more effective than others against different Ark types. But there's a secondary variation that isn't about combat effectiveness. Certain items cause Ark machines to respond differently before combat initiates. Specific configurations of gear, carried passively, seem to affect the attention radius of certain Ark patrols. Not always in the direction you'd expect. Some combinations appear to reduce Ark attention. Others appear to increase it. This behaviour is consistent enough to be deliberate, but the underlying logic hasn't been explained. The last detail I want to note for this chapter is something that took me a long time to notice. In the transition zones between the underground spaces and the surface, the tunnels, elevators, and shafts that connect them, there are marks that appear to be from claws or sharp implements dragged across stone and concrete. They're not Ark machine marks. The profile is wrong for any known Ark type. They're not the kind of wear you'd see from human activity. They're organic. Something with sharp appendages has been moving through those transition zones. Whether it came from above or below, the scratches don't indicate, but they're there in multiple locations, always in the same transition spaces. And they're recent. Chapter 2. The Underground. The communities that formed below. The underground communities in Ark Raiders didn't form the way most post-apocalyptic fiction imagines. There's a familiar template in popular culture. The bunker, the shelter, the planned refuge. Ark Raiders Underground isn't that. It's something messier and more human. The infrastructure that became home to the raider communities was built for entirely different purposes. Transit, utilities, maintenance. It became habitable through necessity and accumulated effort, not through design. And the layers of that transformation are visible in every corner of the underground spaces if you know what to look for. The earliest period of underground occupation is the hardest to read. In the deepest and least modified sections of the tunnel networks, you find the marks of people making the most urgent kinds of decisions. Which passages to seal? Which to keep open? Where to find water? Where to sleep without being visible from tunnel entrances? The physical evidence of those decisions is still there in the scratches, the improvisations, the creative use of materials that were never meant for the purposes they've been put to. The people who first came underground weren't organised, they were surviving. Among the first generation underground materials, items, documents, structural modifications that date to the earliest period, there's a consistent quality of improvisation. But there's also something interesting in the skill level of certain modifications. Some of the early structural work is done with real expertise. Whoever reinforced certain tunnel sections knew what they were doing. The work is solid, well planned, and uses proper technique even with substandard materials. This suggests that, among the first people to go underground, there were some with specific skills that proved useful in ways they couldn't have planned for. The question of who specifically was in the first wave of underground survivors is one the game addresses obliquely through NPC dialogue and environmental storytelling. The implication across multiple sources is that the first underground communities weren't demographically representative. The people who ended up underground in the first weeks were those who happened to be near underground infrastructure when the fall began. Those who had reason to be underground already, maintenance workers, transit staff, people who happened to be in underground spaces at the time, and a smaller number who had specific knowledge or preparation. Among that last group, the people who were prepared, the game suggests different levels of preparation and different types of foreknowledge. Some appear to have been prepared in a practical survival sense. They had supplies, they had plans for where to go. Others appear to have been prepared in a more specific sense. They had equipment that was directly relevant to operating in a post-fall world, not just survival basics. The difference between these two groups matters for how the early underground communities developed. The practically prepared survivors and the specifically prepared ones had different priorities and different ideas about what the underground community was for. That tension between different visions of what the underground community was for is visible in the infrastructure modifications. In one section of the base areas, there's a location where two distinct modification styles overlap. One style is purely practical: reinforcement, insulation, basic habitability improvements. The other style includes elements that suggest specific operational purposes: conduit routing for communication systems, structural supports appropriate for heavy equipment, ventilation modifications that don't fit standard habitation needs. Two different groups with two different agendas modified the same space, and their modifications are laid over each other in ways you can still see. The communication systems in the underground bases deserve specific attention because they're more extensive than they need to be for a simple survival community. Surface to underground communication is obviously important for raiders, but the internal communication infrastructure, the wiring, the relay stations, the routing hardware, is built to a scale that suggests a much larger network than what's currently in use. The current community uses a fraction of the installed communication capacity. Whoever built the system was planning for more users, a larger range, or more complex data traffic than what the raider community currently handles. The excess communication capacity in the underground bases is one of those details that doesn't have an obvious explanation in the current law. One possibility is that the infrastructure was planned for a much larger population that never materialized, that the early underground organizers hoped for more survivors than came. Another possibility is that the infrastructure was designed for a specific purpose beyond simple communication, and that purpose either was fulfilled and is now dormant or was never fulfilled. The amount of hardware dedicated to specific encrypted relay points suggests the latter. Something specific was meant to be communicated through these systems. Moving through the base areas, the evidence of abandoned projects is another recurring theme. In multiple locations, there are spaces that were clearly being converted for a specific purpose and then stopped partway through. Construction materials left mid-task, tools put down and never picked up. In one case, a room where the walls were being lined with a specific material, layers of it, carefully applied, where the lining stops abruptly on 3 sides, and the fourth wall is bare. Whatever the room was being prepared for, it wasn't completed, and given the specific material being used for the lining, it appears to have been designed for sound isolation or signal blocking. Signal blocking rooms in an underground community immediately suggest specific purposes: private communication, secure storage of signal-emitting items, protection from external scanning. The incomplete signal blocking room in the base area is adjacent to one of the sealed sections mentioned earlier. The doors that have been deliberately blocked. The proximity is suggestive. If there was sensitive information or equipment in the sealed rooms, and if someone was building a secure space adjacent to them, the two projects are likely related. Whatever was going on in that section of the base was considered sensitive enough to warrant physical security and signal isolation simultaneously. The food production systems in the underground bases are humble but functional, and they contain their own set of hidden details. Growing lights, hydroponic setups, fungal cultivation. The underground communities have developed multiple methods of producing food without sunlight. The methods vary across different sections of the base, and the variation maps onto the different periods of community development. Early systems are simpler and more improvised. Later systems show more sophistication and better equipment. But there's one section of the food production area where the equipment is neither early nor standard. It's more sophisticated than anything else in the underground, and it appears to have been brought in rather than developed in place. That sophisticated food production equipment has manufacturing markings that match some of the concentrated production regions identified through item description research. It was made in one of those specific regional manufacturing clusters before the fall, and somehow it ended up in the underground community. The provenance of that equipment, how it got from a pre-fall manufacturing cluster to an underground survival community, isn't explained. But given the sophistication of the equipment and the specificity of its origin, it wasn't a random piece of salvage. Someone knew it existed, knew where to find it, and made sure it ended up underground. The medical infrastructure in the underground bases tells a layered story of the community's health history. In the older sections, the medical materials are generic and undersupplied, the kind of thing you'd put together from whatever you could find. In newer sections, the medical supplies are more organized and specific, suggesting either better access to surface resources over time or specific knowledge of what was needed. In between, there are sections that show evidence of specific medical crises, concentrated use of specific supplies, improvisations for treating particular types of injuries or conditions, arrangements for isolation that suggest concern about transmission of something. The isolation arrangements in the mid-period medical section are worth dwelling on. They're not built for standard infectious disease isolation. The materials used and the arrangements suggest concern about a specific type of contamination rather than a general pathogen. The surfaces in that section were treated with materials that would neutralize specific chemical compounds. The ventilation was arranged to prevent particular particle sizes from circulating. Whoever set up that isolation section knew what they were trying to contain, and the type of contamination they were concerned about corresponds to the type of contamination associated with ARC machine proximity. The implication of ARC-related contamination protocols in the underground medical section is significant. It suggests that the raider community has encountered the effects of ARC exposure in a medical context serious enough to warrant specific countermeasures. This could be as straightforward as raiders returning from surface missions with contamination from ARC zones. But the scale and deliberateness of the isolation arrangements suggests something more acute than routine surface exposure. Someone was dealing with a significant contamination event, and they knew enough about ARC-related contamination to respond to it specifically. There's a children's area in the underground base. It's subtle and easy to miss because it's integrated into a larger residential section rather than being its own clearly delineated space. But once you recognize the markers, the scale of certain furniture, the type of simple objects stored in lower areas, the specific materials used for flooring in one section, it becomes clear. There have been children living in the underground community. This is a basic fact about a multi-generational community, but it has implications for the law. Children born underground have never seen the surface. They know about it only from what adults tell them. The children's section of the base contains items that tell a story about how surface knowledge is transmitted to underground-born generations. There are hand-drawn maps, obviously made by children, based on the line quality and scale, that depict the surface in ways that combine genuine geographic knowledge with clearly imagined elements. The children who made these maps have enough information to represent surface geography accurately in some areas and have filled in unknown areas with things that are clearly guessed or invented. The combination tells you what information about the surface is considered important enough to teach, and what gaps exist in that transmission. Among the imagined elements in the children's surface maps, there are recurring depictions of specific features that don't appear in the actual game world surface. One recurring feature is a large open structure that appears in several different children's maps, always placed in roughly the same relative position. It's depicted differently in each map, different artists, different ages, but the basic feature is consistent. A large enclosed space with a specific kind of roof. The children learn to include this feature in their maps. Someone was telling them about it, and it doesn't appear to exist on the current surface, which raises the question of when that information was transmitted and whether the structure still exists. The adults in the underground community have their own set of consistent references in their dialogue and behaviour that point towards specific shared knowledge and shared events. One of the more consistently referenced experiences mentioned in various forms across several NPC conversations is something that the NPCs call by different names but describe in similar terms. An early period when the underground community was much smaller, communications with the surface were more dangerous, and some kind of decision was made about how the community would operate going forward. The details are vague. The references are clearly to a specific event or period, but the specifics are either not remembered clearly or not discussed openly. That formative period in the community's early history is described with a combination of significance and evasion that suggests it's important but uncomfortable. NPCs reference it as the context for current community rules and practices without explaining the connection. Things are done certain ways because of how it used to be or after what happened before. The evasion isn't dramatic. It's more like the way people talk about difficult family history, acknowledgement without elaboration. Something happened in the early underground community that shaped everything that came after, and the current community lives with its effects without fully confronting its content. The records kept by the underground community are extensive relative to what you'd expect from a survival group. Documentation of surface runs, inventories, medical logs, food production records. Most survival communities in games either don't keep records or keep minimal ones. The Ark Raiders underground community is almost bureaucratic in its approach to record keeping. The records go back to the early period, though the oldest ones are damaged and incomplete. What survives of the earliest records suggests that the record-keeping system was established deliberately rather than organically. Someone decided early on that documentation was important and organized it as a formal practice. The decision to prioritize record-keeping from the earliest period is an interesting cultural choice for a survival community. It implies a forward-looking orientation, an assumption that the records would matter in the future, that there would be a future to have records in. It also implies that Whoever established the practice had experience with documentation in their pre-fall life. The oldest records have a structural clarity that you'd associate with professional record keeping, not improvised note-taking. The underground community's first formal archivist, whoever they were, brought professional skills to the task. Within those archives, there are gaps, entire periods where the record density drops suddenly and then resumes. These gaps don't correspond to obviously difficult periods where survival pressure would make documentation harder. Some of them fall in relatively stable stretches of the community's history. The gaps are selective, which suggests either deliberate culling of records, someone removed specific documents, or a period where the archivist or archivists stopped recording certain types of information. What's missing from the records isn't random. The pattern of what's absent suggests that specific categories of information were deliberately excluded from the permanent record. The physical state of some of the surviving old documents is also revealing. Most damaged records are damaged by environmental factors: moisture, physical stress, age. Some of the oldest records show damage that looks different. Specific passages are illegible, not because of environmental damage, but because of what appears to be deliberate obscuring. Ink applied over text, pages that have been partially removed, leaving only the margins. In one document, a name that appears multiple times has been carefully struck through in every instance. Not carelessly obliterated, but deliberately and methodically made unreadable. The struck-through name is one of the more pointed Easter eggs in the underground sections. You can find the document in question in the archival area, and the methodical treatment of every instance of that specific name is unmistakable once you see it. The person who struck it out was thorough. They didn't miss a single instance across a multi-page document. That kind of thoroughness suggests that removing that name from the historical record was important to them. Whether it was the person themselves doing a kind of erasure, or whether someone else was erasing them, the record has been deliberately altered. The name is unrecoverable, but its absence is itself a piece of information. Alongside the records, the underground community maintains a set of oral traditions that show up in NPC dialogue and behaviour in ways that parallel and sometimes contradict the written records. NPCs will occasionally reference stories about the early community that involve events, people, and outcomes that don't appear in any written document. Some of these oral traditions clearly fill in gaps in the written record. They describe the same time periods where written documentation drops off. The content of the oral traditions is more personal and less formal than the written records, and in several cases they suggest that the official documented history and the oral history are describing the same events from very different perspectives. The divergence between written and oral history is something that real communities experience when the official record doesn't capture or chooses not to capture certain truths. In Ark Raider's underground community, the divergence seems to centre on questions of authority and decision-making. The written records suggest a relatively orderly early community with clear leadership. The oral traditions suggest something more contested: arguments, disputes, a period of significant conflict about how things should be done. Neither version necessarily excludes the other. Contested communities often produce official records that smooth over the conflicts, while oral traditions preserve the messier reality. One specific oral tradition that multiple NPCs reference involves a person who came to the underground community from the surface significantly later than the first wave of survivors. This person, referred to by different names in different NPC accounts, arrived with specific knowledge about the Ark machines that the community didn't have. The knowledge was valuable enough that the community integrated this person quickly, despite the circumstances of their late arrival. But the arrival itself is described in ways that suggest it wasn't straightforward. The person came from somewhere. They knew things that suggested direct experience with Ark machines on a level that raiders don't normally survive. The late arriving knowledge carrier is a character type with significant implications for Ark Raiders' lore. If a person survived extended direct experience with Ark machines and arrived in the underground community with specific knowledge about them, that person had a history that the community would want to understand. Where had they been? How had they survived? What had they done to acquire that knowledge? The oral traditions that reference this person are consistent in noting the value of the knowledge, but inconsistent about everything else. The circumstances of the arrival, what the person looked like, whether they stayed or eventually left, these details vary between NPC accounts. The inconsistency in the oral tradition about the late arriving knowledge carrier is itself informative. Community oral traditions tend to be most consistent about concrete observable facts and least consistent about context and background. But in this case, the concrete observable facts are the ones that vary: appearance, origin, circumstances. The one thing that all accounts agree on is the nature of the knowledge and its value. This suggests that the concrete facts were either genuinely unclear, the person wasn't what they appeared, or that the concrete facts were deliberately obscured in how the story was transmitted. The community remembers what was useful. It's been vaguer about who provided it. The underground community's relationship with the surface is characterized by a specific kind of structured risk management that shows up in the raider equipment and training systems. Raiders don't go to the surface casually. There are preparation protocols, loadout standards, and return procedures that have been refined over the community's history. The evolution of these protocols is visible in the training materials that are stored in the base. Early training documents are simple and focused on immediate survival. Later documents incorporate more specific knowledge about Ark machine behavior and safer surface navigation. The progression shows a community that learned from experience in systematic ways. The training materials also show what the community has chosen to prioritize in raider preparation. Combat is addressed but isn't the central focus. Extraction is emphasized heavily, getting back to the underground safely with whatever was gathered. Observation and documentation are also emphasized, which connects to the broader record-keeping culture of the underground. Raiders are expected to bring back information as well as materials. The documentation they produce after surface runs forms part of the community's accumulated knowledge about current surface conditions. This makes individual raiders part of a collective intelligence effort, not just resource gatherers. Within the raider training materials, there are sections that deal specifically with unusual or anomalous Ark behavior, scenarios where machines act outside their established patterns, guidelines for how to respond to unexpected Ark behaviors that don't match normal threat profiles. The existence of these sections in training materials is significant because it implies that anomalous Ark behavior is common enough to warrant formal preparation. Raiders aren't just expected to understand how the machines normally behave. They're expected to handle situations where normal expectations don't apply. The training materials treat Ark behavior as fundamentally unpredictable at its edges. One specific scenario in the training materials describes an Ark machine that has been observed to interact with a surface location over an extended period in ways that don't match patrol or threat response behavior. The scenario advises raiders to observe rather than engage, and to document everything they see. The language used in this scenario is different from the rest of the training materials. More careful, more measured. It reads like it was written by someone with personal experience of the scenario, and the details it includes, specific behaviors to watch for, specific documentation priorities, are too specific to be hypothetical. The underground community's relationship with the surface changes over the time period the game implies. The earlier training materials depict the surface as more uniformly hostile. Later materials reflect a more nuanced understanding. Dangerous, yes, but with pockets that are safer, areas that are better understood, patterns that can be anticipated. This evolution in how the surface is understood corresponds to the accumulated documentation that raiders have brought back. The community has been building a map of the surface that's based on empirical observation rather than assumption, and that map has changed its understanding significantly. The physical maps in the underground base are another source of hidden detail. The most recent maps are accurate to what players experience in the game, but older maps, stored in the archives, show a surface that was different. Areas that are currently inaccessible or heavily arc-occupied appear in older maps as navigable. Areas that are currently clear appear as danger zones. The surface has changed over time, and the maps record those changes. Comparing maps from different periods gives a picture of how arc machine distribution and surface conditions have evolved, and the evolution doesn't follow a simple pattern of steady expansion. Looking at the map evolution, there are periods where arc machine distribution contracted, where areas that were arc-occupied became less so, at least temporarily. These contractions aren't explained in any accompanying documentation. They just appear in the maps as changed conditions. The temporary nature of some contractions, areas that were briefly accessible and then became dangerous again, suggests that arc machine distribution responds to factors that aren't fully understood. What draws arc machines to specific areas, what makes them withdraw, and what triggers re-expansion are questions that the map evidence raises without answering. The personal effects of individual raiders who are referenced in the underground community are scattered through various storage and memorial locations. Among these personal effects, there are collections that suggest specific interests and preoccupations beyond what you'd expect from surface scavengers. One raider's effects include an extensive collection of documentation about pre-fall communications infrastructure, the kind of academic and technical material that would have been of interest to a specialist in that field. Another raider's effects include detailed hand-drawn studies of arc machine designs, not tactical threat assessments, but careful observational sketches, the kind you'd produce if you wanted to understand rather than just survive. Raiders bringing specific professional or intellectual expertise to their surface work is a recurring theme in Arc Raiders' environmental storytelling. The underground community is more than a collection of generic survival experts. It includes people who brought their specific knowledge and continue to apply it in the post-fall context. The distribution of expertise in the community, reconstructed through personal effects and records, includes engineers, researchers, communications specialists, and a range of other professional backgrounds. This wasn't a random cross-section of the pre-fall population. The combination of skills represented in the underground community is more purposeful than accidental survival would produce. The purposefulness of the skill distribution in the underground community is another one of those details that points toward a degree of pre-fall planning. If the community's composition reflects something closer to deliberate selection than random survival, someone chose these people or created conditions that favored their survival. This connects back to the earlier observations about the prepared survivors and the specific equipment that found its way underground. The pieces suggest a prior organization that worked to ensure specific people made it to safety. Not everyone, not a cross-section, specific people with specific knowledge and skills. The spiritual or philosophical beliefs of the underground community are approached carefully in the game. They exist but aren't overplayed. There are small shrines in residential sections, references to practices that carry the feel of collective ritual, objects that are clearly given meaning beyond their practical function. The character of these beliefs isn't religiously specific in a way that maps onto any real-world tradition. They're syncretic and practical, focused on the community's actual situation rather than inherited theological frameworks. What the community believes centers on the surface and its dangers, on the meaning of the raider work, and on the relationship between the living and those who have been lost. One of the shrine areas in the residential section contains an object that doesn't belong to any raider memorial tradition. It predates the underground community and appears to have been carried down from the surface by someone in the early period. The object is a manufactured item from the pre-fall world, a small decorative piece with no obvious practical function. What makes it interesting is that it incorporates one of the recurring symbols identified in the surface graffiti. The same symbol that appears in multiple surface locations that corresponds to arc patrol stopping points appears as a design element on this pre-fall decorative object. The object predates both the arc raiders timeline and any post-fall marking system. The symbol was present before the fall. The pre-fall presence of that symbol on a manufactured decorative object is potentially the most significant evidence for a connection between pre-fall human activity and arc machine behavior. If the symbol appears on a manufactured item, it was incorporated deliberately by whoever designed that item. The design predates the fall, which means the symbol wasn't adapted from arc machine markings after the fact. Either the symbol emerged independently in both human design and arc machine design, suggesting some common mathematical or structural principle, or there was a direct line of influence. And the question is which direction it ran. Within the manufacturing community research, identifying production regions through item descriptions, that same pre-fall decorative object can be traced to one of the concentrated manufacturing regions identified earlier. The region that shows up most frequently in the item description research is the same region that is now heavily arc-occupied, and a product from that region carries the symbol that appears on arc machine structures. The geographic concentration of this evidence is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Something was happening in that manufacturing region that connected it to both the arc machine's arrival and to a symbolic vocabulary that appears in both human and arc design. The underground community's water supply is managed through a system that connects to the surface at a specific point, chosen to minimize arc contamination exposure. The engineering of that connection is sophisticated and shows the same expert-level quality as some of the early tunnel reinforcement work. The filtration system in place at the connection point is designed for arc-specific contamination, which means it was designed with knowledge of what that contamination consists of. Pre-fall water filtration equipment handles standard industrial and biological contamination. This system handles something specific to arc machines. It was either adapted after the fall, with knowledge gained from experience, or it was designed with foreknowledge of what the arc machines would emit. The filtration system's design includes a component that has no analogue in standard water treatment engineering. It's a specific chamber with materials and a configuration that community researchers have compared to experimental filtration concepts from pre-fall academic literature. The academic literature in question was theoretical. These configurations hadn't been implemented in real infrastructure before the fall. Someone took theoretical academic concepts and built them into the underground community's actual water supply. The theoretical work that the system draws on was published before the fall in a specific academic context that, when you trace it, connects to one of the pre-fall research communities that has appeared in other Arc Raiders lore threads. The research community, whose theoretical work appears in the water filtration system, shows up in other places too. The academic document found in the residential location, the one about mathematical patterns in natural systems, is from the same community. The technical schematics found in the apartment with the biological design elements originate from adjacent institutions. Across multiple lore fragments scattered through different zones and different item categories, the same cluster of pre-fall academic and research institutions keeps appearing. They were working on different things, apparently, but in retrospect those things are all relevant to the ARC machines, either by coincidence or by design. The possibility that this pre-fall research community was not working in separate fields, but on related aspects of a single problem is one of the more developed lore threads available to careful players. The mathematical patterns work, the unusual design schematics, the water filtration concepts, and several other fragments of pre-fall academic material all point back to this cluster of institutions. If they were working on different aspects of a single problem, the problem they were working on was the ARC machines, either in anticipation of their arrival or in response to prior contact. The breadth of the research suggests they had a lot to work with. The underground community's relationship with time is captured in a specific way in the base environments. Calendars, clocks, and chronological references are present, but they measure time from a specific starting point that doesn't correspond to any pre-fall calendar system. Time is measured from an event. The community counts years from a reference point that is either the fall itself or something closely associated with it. The community has restructured its temporal framework around the central event of its existence. This is both practically logical and symbolically significant. The world the community lives in is defined by what happened, and their relationship with time reflects that. What the precise starting point of the underground community's calendar corresponds to, whether it's the first day of the fall, the founding of the community, or something else, isn't clearly specified. NPCs reference the calendar, but don't explain its origins. In the oldest archived records, there's a document that appears to establish the calendar system formally, but it references the starting event only obliquely, calling it the beginning of the current period, without specifying what that period began with. The vagueness feels deliberate. Whatever the underground community counts time from, it's something they've chosen to name obliquely rather than directly. That choice says something, even if it doesn't say what. Chapter 3. The First Raiders, Legends of the Surface. The first people to go back to the surface after the fall aren't celebrated as heroes in the underground community's current culture. They're referenced more quietly, as a formative generation whose experiences established the framework that all subsequent raiders have operated within. The mythology around the first raiders is specific in some places and deliberately vague in others, and tracing what can be reconstructed about them tells a story that's more complicated than the founding narrative the community tends to present. The first documented surface runs from the underground community are found in the early archive records, and they're brief and functional. Departure time, what was sought, what was returned with, any ARC machine encounters. The tone is matter of fact, which in retrospect seems either admirably composed or an artifact of shock. The first people who went back up after the fall were going into a world that had been transformed in ways that even pre-fall warnings hadn't prepared them for. The brevity of the early run reports might reflect an inability or unwillingness to process what they'd seen in formal documentation. Between the formal run reports, there are personal accounts, less official, found in residential sections rather than the archives. These give a different picture of the early surface runs. The surface in the immediate aftermath of the fall was described in terms that reflect genuine disorientation. The physical world was recognizable, the same streets, the same buildings, but the context had changed so completely that familiar places felt alien. Raiders described navigating by landmarks they knew and finding that the emotional relationship with those places was severed. Home was not home anymore, it was geography. One of the early personal accounts describes a raider returning to their pre-fall residence on a surface run. The account is one of the longer personal documents in the game, and it's deliberately arranged in the residential area where personal effects are kept in a location that suggests it was placed where it could be found. The raider describes the apartment, the objects left in it, and the experience of encountering their own previous life as artifact. The account doesn't dwell on the emotional content. It's descriptive and almost clinical, but the choice to write it at all, and to write it at that length, is itself a form of processing. What the early raiders found on the surface in terms of ARC machine behavior is described differently in the official run reports versus the personal accounts. The official reports categorize ARC machine encounters by type and outcome, treating them as variables to be logged and managed. The personal accounts describe the machines with more confusion and in some cases more fear than the official reports convey. The personal accounts also include details that didn't make it into official reports. Specific behaviors, specific encounters, things that didn't fit the categories the official system used. The gap between official and personal documentation in the early period is significant. Some of the details excluded from official reports, but present in personal accounts, involve ARC machines behaving in ways that the early raiders found difficult to categorize as simple threat responses. Machines that appeared to be doing something other than patrolling or attacking. Machines that gathered in specific locations for reasons that weren't apparent. Machines that appeared to respond to human presence in ways that didn't follow a simple threat response logic. These observations are in the personal accounts of multiple early raiders, which suggests they were seeing something real rather than individually misinterpreting normal machine behavior. But nothing in the official record acknowledges these observations. The omission from official records of unusual ARC machine behaviors that were personally documented by early raiders points toward an early decision about what kind of information the community would formally acknowledge. Treating ARC machines as simple threats is operationally cleaner than treating them as complex actors whose behavior requires ongoing interpretation. If the community's threat model is simple, training and preparation are simpler. If the machines might do things that don't fit the model, every surface run becomes potentially more ambiguous. The simplification of the official ARC machine model in early community records may have been a deliberate management choice as much as a genuine belief. Among the early raiders who left the most extensive personal documentation, one figure stands out for the quality and persistence of their observational records. The name attached to this documentation appears frequently in multiple archive sections, not struck through like the anonymous name mentioned earlier, but present consistently enough that the community clearly chose to preserve this person's contributions. Their records span an extended period of the early raider generation and become progressively more systematic in their approach to observing ARC machine behavior. The later records look less like survival documentation and more like research notes. The shift in this early raiders documentation from survival-focused to research-focused is visible in the content and structure of the records. Early records follow the standard run report format. Over time, they developed their own notation system, specific symbols for specific ARC behaviors, a classification scheme for different types of unusual encounters, a systematic approach to recording location and time data alongside behavioral observations. This person invented their own research methodology on the surface while also trying to survive. The commitment that represents is significant. They believed the observations were important enough to formalize, even without institutional support. The classification scheme this early raider developed for ARC behaviors appears to have been influential. Later training materials use terminology and categories that derive from that scheme without crediting it. The categories that made it into official training materials are the more conservative ones, behaviors that fit a threat response model. The categories in the original personal records that didn't make it into official materials are the ones that described behaviors outside that model. Someone adapted this person's work for official use, and in doing so, selected what would be formally recognized. The selection was deliberate and it excluded the most interesting observations. The first raider generation also established the routes and methods that later raiders would build on. The initial route maps were developed by individuals making their own assessments and were later shared and refined collectively. The evolution of raider routes over the early period, which can be traced through archived maps, shows how the community's understanding of safe travel on the surface developed. Initial routes were cautious and limited in range. Over time, routes extended and diversified as knowledge accumulated. The process was empirical. Routes changed when individual raiders brought back information that contradicted previous assumptions. Within the early route maps, there are locations marked with specific symbols that don't appear in later maps. Some of these symbols match the broader community notation system. Others are specific to the early period and weren't carried forward into later map-making conventions. The location-specific symbols that weren't carried forward tend to cluster around the same areas that appear in other hidden detail research. Arc patrol stopping points, graffiti symbol locations, proximity to the concentrated manufacturing region. The first raiders were noting something about these locations that later map conventions chose not to preserve. The gear used by first-generation raiders is preserved in certain archival sections, and it reflects a combination of urgency and ingenuity. Equipment was adapted from non-raider uses, combined in ways that required creative thinking and continuously modified based on experience. The material history of early raider equipment shows a rapid learning curve. The earliest items are rough and show significant wear from improvisation. Items from only a few years later show more refined approaches, better material selection, and design improvements that reflect specific problem solving. The gear evolved quickly because the people using it were paying attention. Among the early raider gear, there are items that suggest specific problem types were encountered and addressed. One set of modifications to standard protective gear involves adding specific layering in areas that standard threat profiles wouldn't prioritize. The modifications are consistent across several pieces of early gear from different individuals, which means the modification was either shared knowledge or independently arrived at by multiple people. The area being additionally protected corresponds to exposure zones that would be relevant in prolonged proximity to arc machines, not to arc weapon damage, but to whatever ambient conditions exist near operating arc infrastructure. The ambient condition protection that early raiders were independently adding to their gear is another data point in the picture of arc-related exposure effects. Raiders were protecting themselves from something that wasn't arc weapons, and they were doing it without official guidance, through individual experience and shared informal knowledge. The official training materials from the early period don't mention ambient arc exposure at all. The personal gear modifications show that the first raiders encountered it and responded to it practically, while the official record continued to treat arc machines purely as physical threats. The social structure of the first raider generation is described in personal accounts as more fluid and less hierarchical than the current community structure. In the earliest period, groups formed organically around shared skills and compatible personalities rather than around official roles. Leadership emerged from competence and was temporary, shifting with circumstances. The formalization of the community structure that developed over time is visible in the archives as a gradual process. Specific roles were defined, authority was assigned, official systems were established. But the personal accounts of early raiders sometimes describe this formalization with ambivalence as something that gained efficiency at the cost of flexibility. Within those early informal groupings, certain configurations appear repeatedly in the records. Specific combinations of skills and approaches that kept showing up together in the early run reports. One configuration in particular, an individual with strong arc observation skills, an individual with strong navigation skills, and an individual with strong extraction skills, appears as the core of multiple successful early raider groups. Whether this configuration emerged naturally from the demands of surface work, or whether it was recommended based on prior planning, the consistency of its appearance is notable. The most successful early raider groups, in terms of documented outcomes and individual survival rates, share characteristics that go beyond the skill configuration. They also share an approach to surface work that emphasizes observation over engagement, documentation over immediate extraction, and group cohesion over individual initiative. These values are explicitly stated in some of the personal accounts from early group members. They developed a philosophy of surface work that informed their practices, and that philosophy is more consistent with systematic research than with simple resource gathering. The losses among first-generation raiders were significant. The density of memorial objects in the base areas that date to the early period, combined with the demographic information that can be reconstructed from archival records, suggests casualty rates that were high enough to be genuinely threatening to the community's viability. The community survived the early period, but not without cost. What's interesting in how the early losses are documented is that the descriptions of how individuals died are more detailed in the personal accounts than in official records, and the causes of death don't always match between the two accounts. The discrepancy in documented causes of death between personal and official records is another instance of the broader pattern in early Ark Raiders lore. Official records presenting a simpler, cleaner version of events. In several cases, personal accounts describe deaths that involved unusual Ark behavior or unexplained surface phenomena, while official records describe the same deaths as the result of standard Ark machine encounters. The simplification is consistent with the broader exclusion of unusual observations from official documentation. The community's official history has been edited to remove the complicating elements. The personal accounts preserve them. One of the early generation raiders whose death is documented in both personal and official records is a case study in this discrepancy. The official account is brief. Ark machine encounter, fatal outcome, body not recovered. The personal account, written by someone who was with this individual and survived, is much longer and describes something quite different. The Ark machines involved in the encounter behaved in ways that the author found impossible to categorize as standard patrol behavior. The encounter lasted longer than a typical lethal encounter would, and the machines, after the outcome, didn't move on. They remained in the location. Machines remaining at a location after a lethal encounter is a specific behavior that shows up in several personal accounts from the early raider period. It's not a behavior that's addressed in official training materials. In the cases described, the machines don't appear to be securing the area against additional threats. They don't disperse when other raiders leave, or when the immediate human presence is removed. They remain focused on the specific location where the encounter ended. One account describes a machine in this state remaining at a location for a full day before moving on. The behavior suggests the location itself, or something at it, is what the machine was attending to. The early raider records contain references to locations that became associated with specific kinds of Ark behavior through repeated observation. Places where Ark machines consistently behave differently from their standard patterns, stopping, gathering, attending to something in ways that didn't match threat response. The early raiders developed informal names for these places. Some of those names survive in the community's oral tradition and show up in NPC dialogue as casual references to surface geography. The names are descriptive rather than explanatory: the quiet place, the circle spot where they wait, and they establish a community geography of the surface that maps Ark behavioral anomalies rather than physical terrain. That informal geography of Ark behavioral anomalies on the surface is one of the more interesting examples of knowledge that survived through community culture rather than through official documentation. The locations it describes weren't put on official maps. They weren't incorporated into official training materials, but they were remembered and transmitted through the naming conventions that the first raider generation established. Current NPCs reference these locations by name as if the names are obvious, without explaining them. The knowledge about what the names mean and why those locations are named as they are is embedded in the community's cultural memory rather than in any formal record. The oldest raider gear that survives in the archival sections includes items that were clearly treated as significant beyond their practical function. Gear that's been maintained past the point where it's practically useful, repaired repeatedly until the repairs are more material than the original, kept in places that suggest deliberate preservation. This isn't hoarding or practical efficiency, it's something closer to a relic culture. The first generation's equipment is maintained as something to be kept, not because it might be needed, but because of what it represents. The community has a relationship with its own early history that expresses itself in this careful preservation. Among the preserved first-generation items, several include modifications that appear to have been made after the items were retired from active use. Symbols added, names inscribed, small additions that transform the objects from tools into markers of history. The symbols added to some of these items include, again, the recurring graffiti symbol that appears on the surface, in the pre-fall decorative object, and in arc machine markings. The first generation of raiders was incorporating that symbol into their memorial objects. Whether they understood its significance or adopted it because they saw it on the surface and absorbed it into community symbolic vocabulary, it was meaningful enough to appear in their most carefully preserved items. The relationship between first-generation raiders and the underground community's broader population was complex. Raiders were necessary. The community depended on what they brought back from the surface. But they also occupied a specific social position that wasn't purely functional. The personal accounts describe a kind of status that came with regular surface work and a corresponding social distance. Raiders who went to the surface frequently were seen as different from those who stayed below, in ways that weren't always admiring. The surface changed people, and the community noticed the changes. The specific changes that the community noticed in individuals who spent significant time on the surface are described with interesting consistency across personal accounts. Perceptual changes, sensitivity to light, different relationship with sound, altered spatial orientation in enclosed spaces. Behavioral changes, increased calm in situations that would cause panic in others, decreased engagement with indoor social spaces, a tendency to orient physically toward the underground to surface transition points, even when not preparing for a run. These changes are described as gradual rather than sudden. Prolonged surface work, even relatively safe surface work, did something to the people who did it. The community had informal ways of managing the social integration of experienced raiders, practices that brought surface-changed individuals back into normal community life in structured ways. These practices are documented in the personal accounts as social rituals with specific elements, and their consistency across different accounts suggests they were established community responses to a recognized phenomenon. The community understood that raiders came back different. It had developed ways of acknowledging and accommodating that difference without making it a source of permanent separation. The practices appear simple, but are described with seriousness that suggests they were genuinely important. One of the more specific changes documented in long-term raiders is an altered relationship with arc machine presence. Experienced raiders describe a kind of sensitivity to arc machines that develops with extended surface experience, an ability to sense nearby machine activity through subtle environmental cues before visual or acoustic confirmation. This sensitivity is described in personal accounts as a felt experience rather than a conscious calculation. Not reasoning about what the environmental cues mean, but an immediate, non-verbal awareness. Several accounts describe this sensitivity developing to the point where the raider could sense arc activity through walls or before entering an area. The community's response to this developed sensitivity in experienced raiders varied. In practical terms, the sensitivity was valued. Raiders who could sense Ark activity early were more likely to survive and to protect others on runs. But the sensitivity was also unsettling to those who didn't have it. Personal accounts describe community members who were uncomfortable around highly experienced raiders, particularly around their Ark sensing capacity. The discomfort is described as having a specific quality, not fear of the experienced raiders, but something closer to uncanniness. The capacity to sense machines was felt as something not quite normal, even in a world where nothing was normal anymore. The development of Ark sensitivity in long-term raiders is one of the lore threads that most clearly points towards something the game hasn't fully explained. If sustained surface exposure changes human perception in specific ways, the mechanism of that change is something the game has declined to specify. The contamination effects discussed earlier, the Ark-related environmental changes to vegetation and water, provide a context, but the specific mechanism connecting environmental exposure to enhanced perception is left open. Whatever the Ark machines emit, and whatever it does to biology on contact, it seems to affect human sensory processing in ways that are, at minimum, not uniformly harmful. Early raider accounts that describe the development of Ark sensitivity also describe the experience of the sensitivity as not unpleasant. This detail is mentioned briefly in several accounts, almost in passing, as if the writers were slightly surprised by it. The expected experience of becoming attuned to things that want to kill you is presumably one of anxiety. But the early raiders who described developing this sensitivity describe it as something closer to expanded awareness, uncomfortable in its implications but not in its immediate experiential quality. This distinction is subtle but significant. The Ark machine's effect on human perception isn't purely threatening. Something about it is, in some register, productive. Moving to the topic of first-generation raider deaths and what they revealed about the surface, the patterns in documented lethal encounters from the early period tell a story about what the community learned through loss. Each documented death, correlated with the personal accounts that describe circumstances, adds to a picture of what the surface's dangers actually were in the early period. What kills first-generation raiders disproportionately isn't standard Ark machine engagement. It's a category of hazard that's harder to categorize. Encounters with Ark activity in areas that weren't expected to be active, events at specific surface locations that proved more dangerous than the basic threat model predicted. The locations where early raider deaths are concentrated, when mapped, overlap with the behavioral anomaly geography, the informal naming system for places where Ark machines behave unusually. Raiders died at the quiet places, the circle spots, the places where machines wait. The correlation is clear enough in the data that it must have been noticed by the community at the time. Yet the official training materials don't list these locations as specifically dangerous. They're treated the same as any other Ark-occupied area in the official record. The community knew these places were more dangerous and didn't formalize that knowledge in official guidance. The decision not to formally mark the behavioral anomaly locations as specifically dangerous in official training materials is another instance of the pattern of official simplification. There are two likely reasons for it. One is that the official training framework didn't have a category for dangerous because Ark machines behave unusually here. The threat model didn't accommodate that level of specificity. The other is that marking those locations as specifically dangerous would require explaining why they were dangerous, and explaining that would require acknowledging the unusual behaviors that official records had consistently excluded. The simplification was self-reinforcing. One specific behavioral anomaly location is referenced in enough different sources, personal accounts, oral traditions, early maps, the informal naming system, that it can be considered one of the central mysterious locations in Ark Raider's hidden lore. It appears in sources from the earliest period through the current game environment. It's near the concentrated manufacturing region. It corresponds to an area of significant arc presence, and it appears in the training material scenario about the arc machine, observed interacting with a surface location over extended periods. Multiple independent lore threads converge on this one location. What happens at that location based on the accumulated lore fragments is unclear in its specifics but consistent in suggesting that something significant occurs there. Arc machines gather. Behavior is non-standard. Surface conditions around it are unusual even by arc-influenced standards. Early raiders who visited it and returned described it in terms that suggest something being done rather than simply something being occupied. The machines at this location are engaged in an activity. Whether that activity is maintenance, some kind of signal production, a form of communication, or something else entirely is a question the lore raises without answering. The first generation of raiders also established the community's relationship with the concept of loss and recovery. Not just material loss, the physical items that couldn't be brought back from failed runs, but the more complex loss of people who didn't return. The community developed specific practices around the deaths of raiders that are still in evidence in the current game environment. How the deaths are acknowledged, how personal effects are handled, how the memory of individuals is maintained. These practices were established by the first generation and have been adapted but not fundamentally changed. Within those memorial practices, there's a specific tradition associated with raiders who died at the behavioral anomaly locations. The memorial objects for individuals who died at these locations are distinct from standard raider memorials in specific ways. They include elements that standard memorials don't: small additional objects, specific orientations. In the residential section of the base, these distinct memorials are clustered in one area, separate from the broader memorial groupings. They're recognized as different. The community treats the deaths at these locations as a specific category of loss. The distinctiveness of the memorials for deaths at behavioral anomaly locations is suggestive of a belief that these deaths are different in kind, not just in circumstance. Standard raider deaths are mourned as the community's ongoing cost of operating in a dangerous world. Deaths at the anomaly locations appear to be mourned as something more specific, something that carries additional weight. Whether that weight comes from the specific nature of the danger at those locations, from the losses being associated with particular individuals who are significant to the community, or from a belief about what happens at those locations that the community holds but doesn't articulate openly, the distinction is real. The surface graffiti left by the first raider generation, which can be distinguished from later additions by material degradation and style, is concentrated near the underground entrance points and near the early routes mapped in archived records. This graffiti is mostly functional: route markers, warnings, practical information. But among the functional markings there are personal ones: names, symbols, short statements. Some of these personal markings are clearly memorial in nature, names of people who died in specific locations, placed at the location. Others are less obviously categorizable, short phrases that might be practical warnings or might be something more personal. Observations rather than instructions. One first-generation graffiti inscription, found in a location that corresponds to an early, frequently used route, has been analysed by community researchers in detail. It's a short text in the standard written language of the game world, and it reads as a description of something seen at a specific nearby location. The description is careful and specific: distances, times of day, observed behaviours of machines. It has the quality of a field note rather than an emotional expression. What it describes is arc machine behaviour at the convergence point, the location where multiple lore threads seem to meet. The inscription confirms that the first generation knew about that location and was documenting what happened there. The field note quality of that graffiti inscription and its placement on a surface wall, rather than in the formal archive, is another example of knowledge being preserved outside official channels. The person who wrote it was treating the wall as their notebook, placing the observation where other people going that route would see it. Whether they were unable to get the observation into the official record, or whether they chose not to for reasons of their own, they ensured the information survived in an alternative form. The inscription has been there since the first Raider generation. Most players walk past it. First generation Raider social networks, reconstructed through cross-referencing of names in different archives and personal accounts, show a specific clustering pattern. Certain individuals appear in many documents alongside each other. These clusters suggest the actual social organization of the early Raider groups who worked together, who had close relationships, who influenced whom. Within these clusters, the individuals with the most extensive Ark observation records tend to be connected to each other. The researchers and careful observers of the first generation formed their own informal network within the broader community, sharing information through personal correspondence rather than official channels. The personal correspondence that survives from the first generation's observational network is fragmentary but consistent. Several letters and notes exchanged between members of this informal research network discuss specific Ark behaviours with a technical precision that the official records of the same period don't approach. They're developing a shared vocabulary, testing each other's observations against their own, and building a picture of Ark behaviour that goes well beyond the official threat model. The correspondence suggests that this informal network was aware that what they were seeing was significant and that the official community channels weren't the right place to develop and share that knowledge. What the informal network concluded from their accumulated observations is the most significant gap in the surviving record. The correspondence fragments give methodology and individual observations, but if there was a synthesis, a document pulling the observations together into a coherent interpretation, it hasn't survived or hasn't been found. Given the pattern of selective record preservation noted earlier, the absence of a synthesis document is suspicious. A synthesis that concluded something specific about Ark machine behavior would have been significant enough to either preserve carefully or to remove carefully. Its absence from the archive suggests one or the other. The fate of the informal observational network itself, what happened to those individuals, is another archival gap. They're present in records from the early period. Then their names stop appearing, not through documented deaths in the standard format, but simply through absence. The names that were actively present in documents from the first Raider generation stop appearing in documents from the next period with no explanation. A group of individuals with specific knowledge who were working outside official channels to understand something the community didn't want officially understood simply disappear from the record. Their disappearance from the record has three obvious interpretations. The individuals died, as Raiders did, in the ordinary course of surface work. The individuals left the community, relocated to a different underground group, went somewhere the records don't follow, or the records of their later activities were, like the struck-through name and the selective culling of other archival materials, deliberately removed. The third interpretation is the one that fits the broader pattern of archival intervention. Something was done with the knowledge and the people who had it, and the official record was adjusted accordingly. What the first Raider generation ultimately achieved, beyond the practical establishment of surface operations that the community depended on, was the creation of a knowledge base about Ark machines that went further than the community officially acknowledged. That knowledge base was preserved incompletely, in personal accounts, in graffiti, in memorial objects, in oral traditions, in the informal naming geography of the surface. It survived in fragments that the community carries without always understanding what it's carrying. The Easter eggs scattered through Ark Raider's world are, in many cases, pieces of this fragmented first-generation knowledge, preserved in forms that outlasted the community's attempts to manage what was officially known. Chapter 4: Ark Machine Behavior: What the Patrols. Know the Ark machines that patrol the surface of Ark Raiders are typically encountered as threats, categorized as obstacles, and engaged or avoided depending on the situation. But treating them only as threats misses a significant part of what the game presents about them. The machines have behaviors that extend well beyond threat response, and those behaviors suggest that what they're doing on Earth's surface is more complex than simply killing humans and guarding territory. Patrol behavior in Ark machines follows a logic that isn't simple territory coverage. If it were, the patterns would be random within a given area, grid-based, radiating from a fixed point, or simply wandering. What players who map patrol routes actually find is more structured. Ark machine patrols have consistent orientation. They're moving in relation to something, not just through space. Over extended observation periods, the directionality of patrol routes becomes apparent. The machines are oriented towards specific features of the environment, and the features they orient toward are not obvious. The timing of Ark machine behaviors is one of the more carefully designed elements of the game world. Machines don't operate on identical loops. Experienced players notice that the interval between certain Ark machine behaviors, specific pauses, specific turning sequences, specific encounters with environmental objects, varies in ways that feel deliberate. The variation isn't random, it follows a pattern that has a longer cycle than simple patrol loops. Some researchers have suggested the machines operate on multiple nested timing cycles simultaneously, with different behaviors corresponding to different cycle lengths. If accurate, this would make Ark machine timing genuinely complex to model. The way Ark machines interact with each other is a source of behavior that players rarely observe, because it requires being close enough to see without triggering a threat response. When two or more Ark machines are in proximity and not engaged in active threat response, their behavior toward each other isn't simply neutral coexistence. They coordinate, not in ways that suggest communication in the conventional sense, but in ways that result in coordinated outcomes. Routes adjust in response to each other. Timing shifts to create coverage patterns that single machines wouldn't produce. The coordination is emergent rather than scripted, which suggests the machines have some capacity for dynamic adjustment. There are specific Ark machine types that appear in Ark Raiders that are less encountered and less studied than the standard patrol units. Some of these rarer types appear only in specific zones or under specific conditions. The behavioural differences between these rarer types and common patrol units are significant. Rarer types show more complex environmental interaction. They approach specific objects, spend time near specific structural features, and respond to environmental changes in ways that common patrol units don't. The rarer types look less like security systems and more like something doing a job that isn't security. One category of rarer Ark machine type that has attracted sustained community interest is what researchers have informally designated the observer class. These machines, found in limited numbers in specific zones, don't engage in standard patrol behavior at all. They position themselves in elevated or open locations and remain essentially stationary for extended periods. Their sensors are clearly active. They respond to environmental changes, but they don't pursue or engage with human presence the way patrol units do. They just watch. The question of what they're watching for and what happens with whatever they observe has no obvious answer in the game's current content. The observer class machines, when they do move, follow specific paths that don't resemble patrol routes. Their movements are destination-oriented. They move from one specific location to another, spend time at each, and then move on. The specific locations they visit in sequence don't have obvious connections in terms of game geography or gameplay significance. But when community researchers mapped multiple observer machine movement paths over extended observation periods, a pattern emerged. The paths overlap at specific nodes. The machines are converging on and departing from a set of common reference points, even when approaching from different directions. Those reference point nodes in observer machine movement paths correspond, once again, to locations that appear in multiple other hidden detail threads. The Arc Patrol stopping points, the Graffiti symbol locations, the early raider behavioral anomaly geography, the manufacturing region data, all of these have spatial overlap with the observer machine movement nodes. Whatever those locations are, they're significant to multiple different systems in the game world simultaneously. The convergence of independent evidence streams on the same set of points is one of the stronger arguments for intentional design rather than coincidence. Arc machine response to environmental changes is another behavioral area that rewards careful study. The machines aren't static in their relationship to the environment. They respond to weather conditions, to changes in light levels, to the movement of non-human animals, and to structural changes in the environment. Some of these responses are direct and obvious, changes in patrol behavior during storms, for example. Others are subtler and take extended observation to detect. The machines appear to track long-term environmental conditions in ways that aren't necessary for moment-to-moment threat response. They're monitoring something about the environment beyond the immediate presence of humans. The environmental monitoring behavior of Arc machines becomes interesting when you consider what they're collecting data on. If the machines are tracking ecological conditions, vegetation growth, water quality, temperature distribution, the data they're gathering would describe the effects of their own presence on the surface environment. The contamination gradient, the unusual vegetation, the modified animal behavior, all of this is visible change that a monitoring system would detect. One possible reading is that Arc machines are assessing the progress of the environmental transformation that their presence is causing. Another reading is that they're ensuring the transformation stays within specific parameters. Arc machines show distinct responses to specific types of human equipment beyond the standard threat detection logic. This was mentioned briefly in Chapter 1, but it warrants more detailed examination. Players who experiment with different gear loadouts in non-combat proximity to Arc machines find repeatable differences in machine behavior. The differences aren't random. They correspond to specific equipment properties. Certain combinations appear to affect Arc machine behavior in ways that suggest the machines recognize not just the presence of a human, but specific characteristics of what that human is carrying. The recognition is more granular than threat detection. The most significant equipment-related Arc machine response involves specific communication or signal-producing equipment. Items that generate electronic signals of specific types produce distinct behavioral responses in nearby machines. The responses vary by signal type and intensity. Some signal types cause machines to maintain greater distance, others cause machines to approach. The machine responses to signal types are consistent enough that community researchers have documented them systematically. The pattern of which signals produce which responses suggests that Arc machines categorize human-generated signals against some internal reference framework, and that the categorization affects their behavioral output. That signal response framework in Arc machines has an interesting implication. If the machines categorize human signals against an internal reference, the reference was defined when the machines were created or programmed. Someone made decisions about what kinds of signals would produce what kinds of machine responses. Those decisions were made before the machines arrived on Earth. Whoever created or programmed the Arc machines anticipated encountering specific types of human-generated signals. That level of specificity in the programming implies either prior observation of human technology before the fall, or prior contact that generated knowledge of human communication systems. Arc machine damage response is another behavioral area with hidden depth. Players who observe Arc machines taking damage notice that the response isn't simply threat escalation. Machines that sustain damage change their behavior in ways that go beyond fighting harder. They reposition in specific ways. They signal in frequencies that nearby machines respond to. And in some cases, they do something that looks like retreat towards specific locations rather than simply disengaging from a threat. The locations they retreat toward are consistent. The same kinds of structural features appear in machine retreat behavior across different zones and different damage scenarios. The structural features that damaged Arc machines retreat toward are large, fixed Arc installations. Not the nearest installation necessarily, but specific ones. The choice of which installation to retreat toward appears to be deliberate. Machines move toward installations that are at a distance when closer ones are available. The selection logic isn't distance minimizing. It could be functionality matching. Damaged machines retreating to installations suited for repair or maintenance. Or it could be something else entirely. The specificity of the selection behavior suggests it's more than random retreat. The machines know where they're going. Arc machine communication between units is a subject that the game hints at heavily without explaining directly. Standard game design would suggest Arc machines communicate through simple radio or proximity signals, alerts that trigger shared threat response. The evidence from behavioral observation suggests something more sophisticated. Machines in different zones respond to events in other zones in ways that wouldn't be explained by simple radio signals. The response lag is too long for immediate signal transmission and too short for coincidence. The communication mechanism, whatever it is, operates on a different timescale and potentially through a different medium than standard radio. The possibility that Arc machine communication operates through the surface environment itself, through the contaminated water, through the altered electromagnetic characteristics of Arc-occupied zones, through the unusual vegetation growth that tracks Arc presence, is one of the more speculative community theories. But it fits the available evidence better than simple radio communication. If the machines are both producing and reading environmental signals, their communication network would be exactly as distributed as their physical presence. Changes in one zone's environmental signature would be detectable across the network. The machines wouldn't be transmitting messages to each other so much as modifying and reading a shared environmental medium. Arc machines responding differently to underground versus surface environments is a behavioral difference that raiders who operate in both spaces notice. Machines that pursue humans to underground entrances behave differently at the threshold than they do in open surface spaces. The pursuit behavior modifies at the underground boundary in ways that suggest the machines have specific information about what lies below, not just that the space is physically different. They don't simply fail to pursue because of physical constraints. Their behavior changes in a way that looks like a decision rather than a limitation. The specific nature of the behavioral change at underground boundaries varies by machine type. Some types stop immediately and return to surface patrol. Others approach the entrance and remain for a specific period before disengaging. Others appear to monitor the entrance from a distance after an initial approach. The variation between machine types at underground boundaries maps onto their other behavioral differences. The same types that show more complex environmental interaction, surface side, also show more complex boundary behavior. This is consistent with a single behavioral framework producing different outputs across different machine types rather than types having completely independent programming. Arc machine interaction with non-hostile humans is rarely observed because Arc machines are aggressive toward humans by default. But there are edge cases documented in raider personal accounts where the dynamic was more ambiguous. Situations where a raider was effectively invisible to machines, not because of stealth equipment, but because of circumstances that apparently removed them from active Arc machine threat categorization. The accounts describe the experience of watching machines operate without being noticed. What the machines do when not responding to a human threat is different from standard patrol behavior in consistent ways. The consistent differences in Arc machine behavior when not responding to human threat include what can only be described as purposeful activity. The machines handle specific environmental objects. They approach specific structures and appear to interact with them physically. In some documented cases, machines appear to construct or modify elements of the surface environment in small ways, rearranging objects, clearing areas, maintaining surfaces. None of this fits the profile of a security or patrol system. The machines have work to do that isn't about humans. Human presence triggers threat response that temporarily displaces the other work. But the other work resumes when the human threat is resolved. What that other work is and what its purpose might be is one of the central unanswered questions of Arc Raiders lore. The environmental transformation noted earlier, the contaminated water, the unusual vegetation, the changed ecology, could be a side effect of Arc machine presence rather than a deliberate program. But the purposeful environmental handling behavior documented in Raider personal accounts suggests it might be more intentional than that. Arc machines maintaining and modifying the surface environment consistently, over time, in ways that produce specific ecological outcomes, looks less like incidental contamination and more like terraforming. Arc machines' social structure, if that's even the right term for machine organization, is suggested by behavioral evidence in ways that the game doesn't make explicit. Different machine types appear to occupy different functional roles, not just different combat roles. The observer class machines mentioned earlier behave like a distinct tier. Common patrol units behave like a different tier. The rarer types that engage in complex environmental interaction occupy another tier. The relationships between these tiers, inferred from behavioral observation, suggest a hierarchy in which different types have different authorities and different responsibilities. The hierarchy is functional, not just architectural. Evidence for the hierarchical interpretation comes from observing how different machine types respond to each other versus how they respond to the same stimuli independently. Common patrol units in the proximity of observer class machines show behavioral deference. Their routes adjust to give observer machines space. Their responses to stimuli are modified when observer machines are present. The deference is systematic and consistent. If the machines were simply operating independently, you'd expect neutral coexistence rather than systematic deference. The deference implies recognition of relative status. The common units recognize the observer units as something that has priority. Arc machine responses to the deaths of other Arc machines is another area that gets overlooked in standard gameplay, but reveals something about how the machines relate to each other. When an Arc machine is destroyed, nearby machines respond in specific ways that go beyond alert behavior. The response includes what appears to be a directed transmission from surviving units toward specific fixed installations, distinct from standard threat alerts. The response is brief but consistent. Something is communicated when a machine unit ceases to function. Whether this is a functional system alert, something like a distress signal, or something else is unclear, but the consistency of the behavior across different machine destruction events suggests it's deliberate. The fixed installation that receives the directed transmission when machines are destroyed varies by location. The machines transmit towards specific installations rather than all installations, and the selection appears zone-based. Whatever information the transmission carries, it's going to a specific destination. The installation that receives it apparently processes the information and adjusts something. Area patrol densities sometimes shift after machine destruction events, in ways consistent with a central system, receiving information and updating parameters. The machines aren't just doing their own thing, they're reporting to something, and something is adjusting their behavior in response. One of the more subtle behavioral markers in ARC machines involves their response to the recurring symbol that appears in the game's Graffiti and in pre-fall decorative objects. Testing whether machines respond to that symbol is something community researchers have done systematically. The results are consistent. ARC machines exposed to the symbol in specific presentations show measurable behavioral modification. Not dramatic changes, not cessation of threat behavior, or anything that obvious. But detectable changes in sensor orientation, in approach speed, in the duration of behavioral pauses. The symbol has an effect on ARC machine behavior. Whatever it represents, the machines have a relationship with it. The nature of that relationship between ARC machines and the recurring symbol is ambiguous enough that multiple interpretations are viable. One possibility is that the symbol is part of an identification system, a marker that the machines were programmed to recognize as significant. Another is that the symbol encodes something in its geometric properties that interacts with ARC machine sensor systems in specific ways. A third is that the symbol was adopted by humans because it was observed in ARC machine markings, and the machine's response to it is simply recognition of their own design vocabulary. None of these interpretations is clearly favoured by the evidence. All of them suggest a deeper connection between the symbol's human use and its ARC origin than anyone in the game's world appears to understand. ARC machine behaviour around the specific convergence location, the one where multiple independent law threads meet near the concentrated manufacturing region, is distinct from their behaviour elsewhere in documentable ways. The machines at this location don't simply patrol, they accumulate in ways that suggest the location draws them rather than being assigned to them. Machines from adjacent zones orient toward this location during their off-threat behavioural cycles. The accumulation isn't constant, it varies in density over time, but the orientation toward this location persists across machine types and across extended observation periods. The variation in ARC machine accumulation density at the convergence location follows a cycle that, if community research timing data is right, corresponds to something external. The peaks and valleys of machine accumulation density at that location match a pattern that researchers have correlated with specific environmental readings. The correlation isn't perfect, but it's strong enough that the machine accumulation appears to be responding to something measurable in the surface environment. Whatever is happening at that location has a timing signature, and the machines are tuned to it. ARC machines interacting with water systems is a behaviour that is easy to miss because it tends to happen in locations that aren't on standard radar routes. Machine types that are rarely seen in open patrol territory appear near water infrastructure far more frequently than patrol logic would explain. They aren't simply following humans to water sources, they approach water infrastructure when no humans are nearby, and the interaction they have with it is consistent with the deliberate environmental modification activity described earlier. The machines are managing the water supply. Given the contamination gradient evidence, the management appears to be in the direction of spreading ARC-related contamination rather than cleaning it. One specific ARC machine behaviour that has received limited attention but rewards observation is what happens when machines encounter the physical evidence of human history: pre-fall objects, personal items, written materials. The machines don't uniformly ignore these objects. Specific types of objects produce specific machine responses. Items associated with the concentrated manufacturing region tend to produce longer pauses and more sensor activity than other types of objects. Personal items with the recurring symbol produce the response documented earlier. But there's another category of object that produces yet another distinct response. Items associated with the pre-fall research community identified through the academic literature thread. Items traceable to the pre-fall research institutions produce a machine response that is distinct from both the manufacturing region response and the symbol response. It's more prolonged. It involves a different sensor configuration. In at least one documented case, an observer class machine encountering a research institution document spent significantly longer with that object than with any other type of environmental encounter observed. The specificity of this response, the machine's apparent recognition of research institution origin materials, suggests that the ARC machines have been programmed with specific knowledge about specific pre-fall human institutions. They were sent here knowing what they were looking for. And what they were looking for includes the work of specific researchers. ARC machine behavior, after extended surface occupation, shows changes over time that are visible when you compare early raider accounts with current machine behavior. The machines that raiders encounter now behave differently from the machines described in first-generation accounts. Not dramatically differently, but in ways that are consistent and directional. Patrol cycles are more efficient. Environmental interaction is more developed. The accumulation behavior at specific locations is more pronounced. The machines have been here for a significant period of time, and their behavior has evolved. Whether this evolution is the result of learned adaptation, updated programming from a remote source, or the natural development of complex behavioral systems over time, the machines are not the same as when they arrived. The most significant behavioral change over time in ARC machines, inferred from comparing early and current documentation, involves their relationship with the surface environment. Early accounts describe machines that existed in the environment without deeply interacting with it. Current observation shows machines that are thoroughly integrated with the environment they occupy, responding to it, modifying it, apparently monitoring it with precision. The integration has deepened. The machines have been doing something to this planet for a long time, and they're further along in doing it now than they were when they started. What the machines are ultimately doing, what the environmental modification, the behavioral hierarchy, the monitoring of specific human knowledge, the convergence at specific locations, the contamination of water and transformation of vegetation all add up to, is a question that ARC Raider's current content doesn't answer. The evidence suggests a program of transformation that's been underway since before the machines arrived, that's still ongoing, and that has a destination the machines know and humans don't. The Easter eggs scattered across the game's surface and underground environments are partial glimpses of that program. Each one is a piece of something larger, and the larger thing is still in progress. Chapter 5. The signal, hidden transmissions, and coded messages. The communication landscape in ARC Raider's world is more active than it might appear. Surface zones that look silent are threaded with signals. Players who pay attention to the auditory environment, beyond the ambient noise of ARC machine activity, occasionally hear things that don't fit the expected soundscape. Brief tonal sequences, patterned interference on electronic equipment, sounds that repeat on consistent intervals rather than randomly. These are signals. Most players never register them as anything other than atmospheric detail, but if you track them, they tell a story. The tonal sequences that appear in specific surface locations have been mapped and analysed by community researchers. Each sequence is distinct, but they share structural properties. They're composed of discrete units that repeat in patterns. The patterns have identifiable structure, not random noise, not simple repetition, but organised sequences with internal relationships. The community research consensus is that these sequences are transmissions in some form of encoded communication. They're not decorative sound design, they're messages. Decoding the tonal sequences is a project that has produced partial results. The sequences don't map onto any standard human encoding system. Not Morse code, not binary, not any identified cipher. But the structural properties of the sequences have enough mathematical regularity that researchers have been able to identify repeating units and establish relationships between different sequences heard in different locations. The sequences in different zones share vocabulary. The same discrete units appear in different arrangements. The vocabulary is consistent. Whatever these transmissions are, they're using a consistent system across different locations. The locations where the tonal sequences are strongest and most clearly audible correspond to zones of higher arc machine activity. This would be expected if the sequences are arc machine communications of some kind, but the specific acoustic properties of the sequences, the frequencies used, the modulation characteristics, don't match the frequencies used in arc machine behavior that players can directly observe. The machines emit sounds that are identifiable as machine operational noise. The tonal sequences are something else. They're produced by something that isn't making noise as a side effect of operation. The sequences appear intentionally generated. Beyond the tonal sequences, there are data signals in ArcRaider's world. Terminals, communication equipment, and data storage devices that raiders find on the surface occasionally contain active data, not just archived pre-fall information, but current signals. Signals that are being generated now, not preserved from before the fall. The content of these active data signals is typically encrypted, and the encryption doesn't match any pre-fall system players have encountered elsewhere. The signals are being generated by someone, encrypted with a system that wasn't in use before the fall, and transmitted through infrastructure that was built for human communication. The someone using pre-fall human communication infrastructure with post-fall encryption is generating signals that nobody in the underground community appears to be receiving. The possibility that there are human survivors transmitting on the surface beyond the known underground communities is one that ArcRaider's lore raises without definitively addressing. The underground communities represented in the game are not necessarily the only ones. Surface conditions might allow for small, isolated survivor groups operating in ways the known communities haven't encountered. The active data signals on the surface could originate from such groups, but the encryption system used is too sophisticated for improvised survivor communication. It suggests an organized group with specific technical capacity, not improvised survivors, but people with resources and purpose. There's a specific class of signal in ArcRaiders that has attracted particular community attention, signals that appear to originate below the surface rather than from the surface or above. Deep subsurface transmissions that can be detected on sensitive equipment brought to specific surface locations. The signal sources are located below the deepest sections of the known underground community infrastructure. Whatever is transmitting from below is in spaces that neither the current raider community nor any previously occupied underground layer appears to have accessed. The deep transmissions are coming from somewhere that players currently can't reach. The content of those deep subsurface transmissions, to the extent that they can be characterized, is different from the surface-level tonal sequences. The deep transmissions have characteristics associated with large-scale, organized communication rather than the more intimate signal structure of the surface sequences. They're regular, high power, and complex. They're not the kind of thing you'd produce with improvised equipment. Something with significant technical capacity is transmitting from deep underground, and it's been doing so for long enough that the transmission infrastructure is established and operating consistently. The relationship between the deep subsurface transmissions and the arc machines is ambiguous. Arc machines don't obviously respond to the deep transmissions. They don't orient toward the transmission sources, don't modify their behavior in zones where the deep transmissions are strongest, don't appear to be receiving and responding to that particular signal channel. This could mean the arc machines can't detect the deep transmissions, or it could mean they're already aware of the source and don't need to respond to the signals because they know what's generating them. The absence of ARC machine response to the deep transmissions is itself informative, but what it informs is unclear. Pre-fall communication infrastructure that survived the fall is scattered throughout the surface zones, and some of it is still operational in degraded form. Relay towers, satellite dishes, buried cable networks. The infrastructure is damaged, but not all of it is inoperable. Certain pieces of pre-fall communication infrastructure in the game appear to be actively receiving signals, as well as whatever they may be transmitting. Some of the terminals connected to this infrastructure display incoming data when powered up. The data being received comes from outside the local zone, from locations that the communication infrastructure was originally designed to connect to. Some of those locations are beyond the currently accessible game world. What's being transmitted from beyond the currently accessible game world is a category of Easter egg that the game plants clearly without answering. Multiple pieces of active pre-fall communication infrastructure receive data from distant sources. The data isn't decipherable in most cases, but the fact of its existence, that something beyond the accessible surface is transmitting, and that the infrastructure to receive it is still partially functional, suggests a world beyond the current game map that has active communication activity. Something out there is still broadcasting. Whether that something is human ARC or something else is a question the game raises and doesn't answer. The signals in ARC Raider's underground environment are different in character from the surface signals. Underground, the signal environment is dominated by human-generated communication. The Raider community's internal communication systems, the degraded signals from equipment that was carried underground during the fall, background electromagnetic noise from the improvised power infrastructure. But within that human signal environment, there are anomalies, signals that come from sources that aren't part of the Raider community's communication infrastructure, and that don't appear in the pre-fall infrastructure records that are archived underground. Those anomalous underground signals are irregular rather than consistent, which is part of why they get overlooked in day-to-day community life. They don't follow the regular patterns of either the surface sequences or the deep subsurface transmissions. They appear at irregular intervals, last for variable durations, and come from sources that shift location. The shifting source characteristic is the most unusual property. A fixed transmission source would maintain a fixed apparent location. Something that produces signals from shifting locations is either mobile or is a distributed system activating different nodes at different times, or represents a physical phenomenon that players haven't catalogued yet. Community researchers who have tracked the anomalous underground signals over time have identified what appears to be a progression in their behaviour. Early tracking data from before the research efforts was formalised is fragmentary but consistent. The signals are described as more scattered in earlier periods. More recent tracking data suggests the signals have become more organised, their intervals more regular, their source locations less random, their content more structured. Something about the underground signal activity is developing over time. The anomalous signals are not static background noise. They're doing something, and what they're doing is evolving. The coded message interpretation of specific in-game text is another area where ARC Raiders rewards close reading. Certain documents, item descriptions, and terminal readouts contain text that functions on a surface level as normal content, labels, descriptions, technical information, but that, read differently, contains secondary information. The secondary information requires specific keys to access, pattern recognition, positional reading, frequency analysis, and the keys aren't provided anywhere in the game explicitly. Players who found them did so through sustained attention and creative analysis, but the secondary information is real and consistently encoded rather than coincidental. One specific document type that players have confirmed carries encoded secondary information is the pre-fall academic literature found scattered through the surface zones. The visible content of these documents is legitimate academic material, research writing in appropriate academic style. But when specific fields of the documents are analysed by position rather than by content, when you read the first word of every paragraph, or the last letter of every sentence, or apply other positional reading strategies, coherent secondary text emerges. The secondary text isn't a complete message in any case found so far, it's fragments, but the fragments are consistent with a larger message being distributed across multiple documents. The hypothesis that the pre-fall academic documents are carriers for a distributed hidden message is one that the community has been testing systematically. The challenge is identifying all the documents and the right reading key. Different documents appear to use different positional reading strategies, suggesting either different encoders or deliberate variation to make simple pattern recognition harder. What fragments have been recovered through the most successful reading keys are consistent in subject matter. They reference the ARC machines, specifically their purpose and their programming, and they're written in a tone that suggests the writer knew what they were describing and was trying to ensure someone in the future would understand it. The pre-fall research community that keeps appearing across multiple evidence threads is the most likely origin of the distributed hidden message. If members of that community knew what the ARC machines were and why they were coming, and if they anticipated that this knowledge would be dangerous to hold openly, encoding it in academic documents is exactly the kind of thing they might do. The documents would survive the fall. They'd be found by survivors. Someone who knew to look would be able to read the secondary messages. The distribution across multiple documents protects against any single document being found and destroyed. It's a sophisticated information preservation strategy. What the recovered fragments of the encoded academic documents say, combined into the most coherent narrative the community research has been able to produce, is incomplete but suggestive. The fragments appear to describe the ARC machines as purpose-built systems sent from a specific origin point for a specific objective. The objective, as best as can be reconstructed from available fragments, is described in terms that suggest a biological or ecological process rather than a military or territorial one. The machines were sent to do something to Earth's biosphere, not to kill humans specifically, to change something about the planet on a fundamental level. The human deaths are incidental to a larger biological program. The biological program interpretation of ARC machine purpose connects to the environmental transformation evidence from earlier chapters. If the machines are changing the surface ecology, contaminating water, altering vegetation patterns, modifying the electromagnetic environment, and if this is part of an intended program rather than incidental damage, the machines are doing exactly what they were sent to do. The surface is being transformed according to a plan. The plan is large enough in scale that humans are essentially a minor obstacle within it rather than the primary target. This reading is disturbing in a specific way. The ARC machines aren't at war with humanity. Humanity just happens to be in the way. In the game world's underground communications infrastructure, there are message fragments stored in dead drops, physical storage devices left in specific locations rather than transmitted. These dead drops are typically found in places that required specific knowledge to identify. Not hidden in the obvious sense, but placed in locations that only someone with specific contextual knowledge would look. The messages in these dead drops are distinct from the encoded academic documents. They're written in plain language, addressed to specific individuals, and contain operational information, coordinates, timing information, descriptions of specific surface locations. The operational information in those dead drop messages is consistent with planning for surface activities that aren't described anywhere in the community's official records. The coordinates in the messages correspond to specific surface locations, some of which overlap with the convergence point, and other anomaly locations identified in other research threads. The timing information appears to reference specific event windows, periods when the described surface activities would be possible or advisable. Whoever was leaving these dead drops was planning specific surface operations, coordinating with specific individuals, and doing so entirely outside the community's official channels. Dead drop message recipients, where they can be identified from context, include individuals from the first generation observational network, the network that disappeared from the official record. This is another connection between the hidden lore threads, the informal research network, the hidden encoded documents, the dead drop communications, and the convergence location all appear to be parts of the same story. A group of people in the first Raider generation were coordinating specific activities related to ARC machine behavior and the convergence location, using communication methods that bypassed official oversight and then vanishing from the official record entirely. Signal analysis of the first broadcast fragments, the ones that cut off mid-sentence at the start of the fall, suggests that not all broadcasts were disrupted by the same mechanism. Most of the mid-sentence cutoffs are consistent with abrupt signal loss from a single interruption source. But a small number of broadcast fragments end differently. Not abrupt cutoff, but gradual signal degradation, the kind you'd get from a transmitter being physically moved or damaged rather than the signal being jammed. For those specific broadcasts, the interruption appears to have been local and physical rather than remote and electronic. Someone at the transmission site itself caused those specific broadcasts to end. The idea that some broadcasts at the start of the fall were locally interrupted, that someone was physically at the broadcast sites and stopped specific transmissions, points toward deliberate suppression of specific information rather than general communication disruption. Not everything was stopped by the ARCs. Some things were stopped by humans who had reasons to stop them. What those specific broadcasts were saying before they were interrupted, and who had reasons to interrupt them, is a question the signal analysis raises clearly and leaves entirely unanswered. The ARC machine's own signal activity is partially observable in-game in ways that most players don't examine. The machines emit signals as part of their normal operation, the electromagnetic noise of active machinery. But within that operational noise, there are structured components, signals within signals, brief bursts of organized data embedded in the operational electromagnetic output of ARC machines at specific intervals. These embedded structured signals are consistent across machine types. They appear in the output of patrol units, observer units, and fixed installations alike. Whatever is being transmitted through these embedded signals is going to and from all machine types. The content of the embedded structured signals in ARC machine output has resisted decoding. The encryption is more robust than anything else in the game's signal environment. Community researchers who have made the most progress on decoding other signal types have had the least success with the ARC machine embedded signals. The signals are clearly organized, they have identifiable structure properties, but the structure doesn't map onto any framework that human researchers have found useful. This is consistent with the signals using an encoding system that didn't originate with human cryptographic traditions. It wasn't designed for humans to read. One approach to the ARC machine, embedded signals that has produced limited but real results, is cross-referencing them with the recurring symbol. The symbol's geometric properties, analyzed mathematically, produce a set of structural relationships that have partial correspondence with the organizational properties of the embedded signals. The correspondence isn't complete. The signals are more complex than the symbol alone would generate, but the overlap is real and statistically significant. The symbol encodes a subset of the organizational principles used in ARC machine communication. Understanding the symbol more deeply might provide a key for understanding the signals more fully. The deep subsurface transmissions, compared analytically to the arc machine embedded signals share organizational properties that the surface tonal sequences don't have. This is the clearest evidence for a relationship between the deep underground transmissions and the arc machines. Whatever is transmitting from deep underground is using organizational principles similar to arc machine communication. The deep transmissions aren't human origin signals that happen to be underground. They're connected to the arc machine communication system in some way. Something underground is talking to the machines, or the machines are talking to something underground. The signal analysis can't determine the direction of the conversation. One Easter egg in the signal domain that is found in a very specific and non-obvious location is a recording device that still has power in a particular surface structure. The device has been recording since before the fall. Its memory contains an unbroken record of electromagnetic signals in that location from the pre-fall period through the current day. The early portion of the recording from before the fall shows a signal environment that is recognizable as pre-fall human electromagnetic activity. Normal commercial radio, television signals, mobile data networks. Then the fall begins, and those signals disappear. But something else appears almost immediately. Signals that begin before the human signals have fully died out. The arc machines were already transmitting before their attack finished. Before it started, in fact. The arc machine signals in the pre-fall recording, detected before the fall began, are consistent with reconnaissance rather than attack preparation. They're exploratory signals, the kind you'd produce to map an environment before committing to operation within it. The arc machines were scanning Earth before humans knew they were there. The scanning preceded the fall by a period that the recording suggests was substantial, days rather than hours. The ARCs didn't arrive and immediately act. They arrived and surveyed. They knew what was here before they started affecting it. The entire premise of the fall being a sudden, overwhelming event is partially undermined by the recording. The ARCs chose their moment after a period of careful observation. The signal environment in Arc Raider's world is, in summary, significantly more active and information-dense than the surface appearance of a post-apocalyptic wasteland would suggest. Transmissions of multiple types, from multiple sources, using multiple encoding systems, are continuously active across both surface and underground environments. The human community in the game is aware of some of this activity, their own signals, the obvious arc machine emissions, but largely unaware of the rest. The tonal sequences, the deep subsurface transmissions, the encoded academic documents, the dead drop messages, the pre-fall recording, and the anomalous underground signals all represent communication activity that the raider community doesn't have a framework for understanding. The game world is talking to itself. Most of the conversation is in languages nobody in the game currently speaks. Chapter 6. The Old World's Remnants, Artifacts and Documents. The pre-fall world in Arc Raiders exists primarily as physical artifact, things left behind, objects preserved by circumstance, documents that survived destruction. The game doesn't present much of the pre-fall world through narrative or explanation. It presents it through things, and the things, examined carefully, build a picture of a world that was more complicated in its final days than most people in the current game world appear to know. The material culture of the pre-fall world, as represented through items found in surface zones, reflects a specific period in technological development. Communications technology was advanced and ubiquitous. Transportation infrastructure was extensive. The energy infrastructure, based on what's preserved on the surface, was transitioning between different generation technologies at the time of the fall, older systems operating alongside newer ones, upgrade projects mid-implementation. This transition state in energy infrastructure is a detail that accumulates significance when you consider what the arc machines require to operate. Arc machines don't carry their own energy supply, or if they do, it's supplementary to something else. The fixed arc installations appear to draw energy from the surface environment in ways that are compatible with specific types of human energy infrastructure. Not all of it. Specific types. The compatibility between certain pre-fall energy systems and arc machine energy needs is a correlation that community researchers have flagged without finding a clean explanation for. Either the arc machines were designed with knowledge of human energy infrastructure, which implies prior contact, or the specific energy systems compatible with arc machines are compatible because they exploit physical principles that the ARCs also exploit, which implies a deeper physical connection. The pre-fall energy infrastructure that is most extensively preserved on the surface correlates with what was described as the newer systems being installed during the infrastructure transition. This is unexpected. Older infrastructure tends to be more robustly built and more likely to survive catastrophe. The fact that the newer systems are better preserved suggests either that they were protected by something, or that whatever the ARCs did during the fall didn't affect them. The older infrastructure shows heavy arc-related damage in many zones. The newer systems show much less. This distribution of damage is consistent with arc machines selectively avoiding certain types of infrastructure. The documents preserved in pre-fall residential and commercial spaces are stratified in what they reveal based on how long before the fall they were produced. Documents from years before the fall describe a world that seems normal: commercial activity, professional communication, academic publication, personal correspondence. Documents from the final months before the fall carry more tension. References to disruptions in communication systems, unusual regulatory activity, sudden changes in certain industrial sectors. Documents from the final weeks are different in character, shorter, more urgent, incomplete. The texture of the pre-fall world changed noticeably in its last period, and the documents capture that change. Regulatory activity in specific industrial sectors shows up consistently in late pre-fall documents. Companies and institutions associated with the concentrated manufacturing region appear in regulatory filings, legal notices, and government correspondence with a density that doesn't match their apparent scale. Something about the activities of organizations based in that region attracted official attention in the final period before the fall. The nature of the regulatory interest isn't fully clear from what's preserved, but the volume of official documentation focused on that region in the final pre-fall period is anomalous. Connected to the regulatory attention on the manufacturing region is a category of pre-fall document that players encounter very rarely: what appear to be government or official institutional communications that were not meant to be public. They're found in locations that suggest they were improperly removed from secure contexts, carried by individuals who shouldn't have had them, and abandoned when circumstances prevented their safe return. These documents don't follow the format of public government communication. They're internal, the kind of paperwork that stays within institutions. Their presence on the surface in ordinary locations means someone brought them out. The content of those leaked internal documents, where legible, addresses the same pre-fall research community that appears across multiple evidence threads. The documents reference institutional activities, funding flows, specific project names, and in a few cases, specific individuals.